Chapter 24 of Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba by Seckatary Hawkins. Lost in the Treasure Cave. I don't remember any time in my life that I had such a strange feeling as I had when I followed Lucio and Doc Waters through that low doorway into the treasure chamber. I never really believed in ghosts, but I always imagined that what other people believed to be ghosts were something nobody could understand. And I have always felt that way. While I did not expect to see a ghost pop up in front of us, I believed, as Lucio believed, that there was something, some kind of danger that no one could understand, waiting for those who entered that place that so many persons had told us was haunted. But as Valdez cast his light about the chamber, all fear was forgotten for the time being. We stood in a damp, chilly, gloomy place. The air smelled musty and stale. The bright ray of light from the electric lantern cut like a sword through the deep darkness of the place. "Well," said Lucio, who was the first to speak, "here we are, and there is the treasure chest, just as your lame man said, Hawkins." And there it was. On the floor, in the center of the chamber, stood an iron-bound seaman's chest, the lid thrown back and leaning against the floor. It was empty. Only the dust of many years covered the bottom of that chest that once upon a time contained gold and precious stones. A number of rocks cut out of the cave lay about, and we all seated ourselves and stared at the empty chest. "Gone," said Doc Waters at last. "We should have believed the lame man." "Somebody found it," I said. "And it wasn't Uncle Raphael either." Lucio looked at me quickly. "What do you know, Seckatary?" he asked. "I'm just figuring it out," I said. "Oh, yes," laughed Doc. "Hawkins begins to figure things out right away. Maybe you can tell us who was lucky enough to get here first, Hawkins." I shook my head. "Not yet," I said, "but give me time. I think I can figure it out. The treasure was here. That I know for sure." "I think so too," said Lucio. "The chart looks genuine enough. Elam, the lame man, said so too." "Yes," I said. "The chart was an honest one, Uncle Lucio, but somebody stole it or got a copy of it." "Yes, I see," said Lucio. "By Jove, Hawkins, you've given me something to think about." "Well," asked Doc, "let's hear about it, if it will tell us where the treasure really is." "That I cannot promise," continued Lucio. "But if the owner of the chart knew that somebody had a copy of it, he would remove the treasure to a new place, wouldn't he?" "Sounds likely," answered Doc. "Well, then that's what happened. I believe I can understand now why we had that midnight prowler in the library. Somebody knows about the treasure being taken to another place. A new chart must have been made, showing where the treasure was moved to. And that's what the stranger was looking for in the books of our library at the Villa Casanova." "That's just the way I figured it, Uncle Lucio," I said. "So I suppose there's nothing to do but go back to the villa and search every book in the library in the hope of finding another chart," said Doc Waters. "I'm going to explore this place through before I go," said Lucio. "What do you say, Hawkins? Do you care to go further underground with me?" "I don't see how you can get any farther," I answered. "There does not seem to be any other opening in this chamber but the little door through which we came." Lucio held up his hand. "I can feel a draft over my head," he said. "Wait a minute." He took a cigar out of his packet and gave one to Doc Waters. They both lit their smokes, and I waited to see what that had to do with finding another way out. Lucio blew the smoke from his lips in great puffs and watched it circle over his head, and then sailed swiftly toward the low door by which we had entered. "Oh," he said, "there you are. Notice how the smoke blows straight away from the corner yonder. There is an opening there through which a draft comes." "I can't see a thing," I said, throwing the ray of my electric flash in the direction he indicated. "No," said Lucio, "but it's there, up higher. Hold your light steady. Now, do you see?" I saw it all right, but it looked like a hole barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. "I can get in it all right," I said, "but how can you squeeze through that?" Lucio laughed. "Are you coming with us, Dr. Waters?" he asked. "I think I had better go back and stay with Link," replied Doc, "for something might happen. I never like to leave the boy alone for any length of time." "Very well," said Lucio. "It is a sensible thought. You and Jeff Lambert and Link wait for us up on the rack. If we do not get back in time, you three can go to Jeff's little cabin in Casanova's rocks and wait there for us. He can fix you a supper, I guess." "How long do you think you will be gone?" asked Doc nervously. "As long as it takes me to size up this pirate nest," answered Lucio cheerfully. "It may be a bigger place than I expect, or it may be that we shall find it interesting enough to push farther under these rocks. Anyway, you can wait for us tonight in the cabin in case we do not get back before dark. And if we should find you still absent in the morning, then get in the boat and you take charge and tell Harris to make haste back to the villa. Here is my lawyer's name and address," handing Doc a card, "which you will take immediately upon arriving at the villa, and tell him that I went in here and did not come out. He will know what to do." "All right," said Doc. Then he glanced at me and turned again to Lucio with a worried look. "And Hawkins," he continued, "you know I am responsible for his safety. If anything should happen to him, Lucio, his mother and dad would never want to see me again." Lucio patted the kind old doctor's shoulder. "Never fear," he said. "Hawkins is able to take care of himself, and I think I am able to put myself through anything, even that little hole we intend to enter. The two of us together ought to be able to come out all right. Ah, Hawkins, come, we will see Dr. Waters up the rope before we start. Valdez Alvarez, will you be so kind as to lead the way out of this dungeon?" And so we all followed the Spaniard's ray of light up the passage, and out again in the hole in the side of the rock, where Doc grasped the hanging rope and started up. It seemed to me that Dag found it a hard job for a fat man to climb up a rope, but he made it safely, and waved his hand at me as I glanced up as he stood on the table rack. In a moment I saw the faces of Link and his daddy also peering down and waving at us. Then we went back into the treasure chamber. Nothing was said as we prepared to enter the little hall. Valdez first shoved into it his 2 leather bags, then his electric lamp, and then wriggled through himself, although he made a tight fit. "Up you go, Hawkins," said Lucio as he lifted me, and I started through the opening. It was not a hard matter for me, and I found Valdez standing in a broader place, throwing his light about the walls that were dripping with moisture. Lucio came in behind me, and there we stood, looking around this strange and dismal place. The roof sloped downward until it almost met the floor at the farther end. On both sides, however, were rooms branching away from the main cavern. "It's grand, isn't it?" said Lucio to me. "Just look at those sparkling icicles yonder in that middle corridor. By Jove, Hawkins, I wouldn't be surprised if the man who found the treasure had hidden it somewhere hereabouts." Valdez spoke a few rapid sentences in Spanish. "Valdez says the whole place is said to be tunneled out like this," explained Lucio. "All right, Senor Alvarez, pick out your own path and lead up through." The Spaniard started on ahead of us, lighting the way, and we followed to the left narrow cleft that was chilly and damp, and sloped downward at such a rate that we were finally forced to increase our speed. There came to our ears presently a soft, rushing sound, and the farther we went, the louder it grew, until when we stopped to rest, it was like a roar. "What is that?" I asked. "We are under the sea," explained Lucio. "These rocks extend far out, sloping down from the shoreline. The sea washes over them, and the farther we come down under here, the deeper the water. Listen, hear those breakers roar." I listened to the moaning for a while, but I did not like it, and I said so. I could not feel safe with an ocean over my head, even if it were 1,000 tons of rock between the water and us. We started back again, seeing nothing of any interest except the beautiful glistening icicles that hang everywhere from the roof of the cavern, until Valdez stopped with a puzzled look. "What is it, Valdez?" asked Lucio. We had come to a crisscrossing of the passages. None of us had noticed it on our way down. It was like a crossroads, and we stood there wondering which was the one by which we had come. Lucio studied it for a moment and then said, "I could swear we did not pass this before. Let us go back, Valdez. We have, perhaps, taken a different path." We went back to where the sea roared over our heads, and with much flashing of the electric lamp, we discovered not only another way out, but several. It was now a matter of guesswork. We finally flipped a coin, and chose the one that seemed to lead in a straight direction, back to our starting place. But as we continued to walk up that way, I began to realize that we were wrong again. There was no use. We had been confused. We had lost our way. "Good Lord, Lucio," I said, Suppose we are lost in this underground place." Lucio probably did not hear me, for he was standing with his hat in one hand and scratching his head with the other. "Valdez," he said, "did you bring a compass?" Of course, a man can't remember to bring everything, and Valdez had overlooked that. There had been several in the boat, he explained. He did not think we would get lost and need one away from the boat. We excused him for that, but we were lost in a place that was not likely to prove a very pleasant home. I need not go on with our experiences. We went back and forth. We tried this passage and that, only to come out at some new angle, more confused than before. We were getting deeper and deeper into the hollow rocks. We found ourselves finally in a roomy passage, in which the sound of the sea washing up over our roof was even louder than in the first place we had heard it. But we were all tired out. We had been rambling through these damp passages now for almost 2 hours. The idea began to frighten me. The electric lamp Valdez carried was beginning to grow dim. My pocket flashing alone remained, and I put it away safely in my pocket, determined to save it in case we found ourselves in the dark. "Well," said Lucio, "let us rest. It is about time for dinner, Valdez?" "And I'm hungry," I said, "but I suppose it's no use wishing for something to eat. How long do you think we will have to stay here, Uncle Lucio?" "Lord help us, I don't know," said Lucio. "But never say die, Hawkins. I learned that in the States. We will find a way. There is always a way for everything." "Dinner," said Valdez quietly, and in a fairly good English. We turned with surprise to where he stood. He had set the lamp on the floor, and its feeble light showed a white cloth spread upon the rocky floor, and upon it a fairly good meal of cold victuals and milk. "Well, of all the surprises," I began. But then I saw what those big leather bags were for, the ones that held this and that, and everything that I noticed were carried on the Spaniard's shoulders when we started on this trip. "Valdez Alvarez," said Lucio, "you are a noble Spaniard, no matter what evil pirates your ancestors may have been." "Muchas gracias, señor." We ate in silence, Valdez refusing to touch a piece of food until we had partaken of all that we desired, and feeling my hunger appeased, but my eyes very heavy, I sat with my back against the rocky wall, and within a few minutes I was sound asleep. I slept soundly the whole night through, although I had occasional bits of dreams about pirates and treasure, and of starving to death in a cave. But when I opened my eyes, I heard Lucio and Valdez talking, but the place was pitch dark. "Slept enough, Hawkins?" called Lucio. "Sorry, can't see you, but our lamp gave out some time during the night. Slept pretty well myself, but the floor was a hard bed. How do you feel now?" I realized then that Lucio was trying to cheer me up, although he knew, too, that we were in a pretty bad fix. But I surprised him when I pulled out my pocket flashlight and turned it on them. "If we use this sparingly," I said, "we might have enough light to help us till we get out of here anyway." Without much ado, Valdez went again to the leather bags and took out enough food for a little breakfast, although we had no more milk or drink of any kind. After it was over, we packed up again and started forward. "Might as well keep moving," said Lucio, "for by moving we might strike an outlet from this place." Yet, even though we walked and walked, turned into this way and that, we found not the slightest crack in the rocks through which daylight could enter. We walked for hours. At 12 o'clock noon by Lucio's watch, we sat and rested, and ate the last of the lunch in the leather bags. But when we started again, somehow or other, I get a hopeful feeling that this thing could not last. Surely we must find our way out, or else arrive again at the place where we had entered. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Lucio called my attention to the fact that we had not heard the roar of the sea over our heads for some time. "Therefore," he said, "we are no longer near the ocean. We have come away from it." And so it appeared, too, and now the passage narrowed before us, until we could but go in single file. For a full hour we walked this narrow corridor, until Lucio called a halt. "Look," he said, "the end of the rocks. See, there are steps leading down." And I saw that the passage ended abruptly, and that steps cut out of the rock led down to a narrower opening. My flashlight, from constant use, was fading to a dim light, but it was enough to show that what we now were entering was a tunnel, and dug out only a short time, for the reddish clay was yet soft, and smelled like the grave. But we did not pause. We pushed ahead, knowing not where we went or why, but just hoping that sooner or later we would come to an outlet. At the end of 2 hours the flashlight went out, and we were compelled to sit and rest in the dark. None of us spoke until Lucio called the rest at an end and started us off again. But our hopes fell flat when at last Lucio, who was leading, ran up against the wall and said, "This is the end. This is as far as it goes." I suggested that we go back immediately. I was excited. All we could do was to keep on moving, for by standing still we could never hope to find our way out. But Lucio said, "Rest," and we sat down at the end of that long, dark, and painful hike. Discouraged and frightened, I tried to feel my way around, to get an idea of what sort of a place we were in now. It was pitch dark, but I gathered from passing my hands around the walls that we were in a chamber that was round at one end and straight on the other 3 sides. Suddenly my hand came in contact with something. "Lucio!" I cried. I heard him stumbling over to me in the dark. "Where are you, Hawkins?" he cried. "Here!" I yelled, and "Here! Here! Here!" until he was beside me. "Feel up here on the wall?" I yelled as he reached up, and together we pulled and strained at the iron bar that I had found there fastened to a heavy iron chain. A great heavy latch, the key to escape, I felt sure. "Slowly, Hawkins," whispered Lucio as we continued to pull. "Come here, Valdez. Give us your hand." The Spaniard was beside us now, and the 3 of us, weak though we were from our experience of the underground jaunt, finally made the heavy latch move. Slowly the thing came over, and it seemed as if the entire wall were moving out upon us, and we leaped back, Lucio dragging me as he went. Then, as the huge door gradually opened, the sight that lay before us made me rub my eyes and wonder if I were awake or only dreaming. We were gazing into the big living room of Villa Casanova. I was the first to leap through the door. As I turned, I saw that the door that had opened inward was really the big painting of the civilian captive that occupied one side of the living room of the villa. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba by Seckatary Hawkins. Link disappears. I was so happy to get out of that dark tunnel that for a moment the discovery of the great hidden door did not impress me much. But when Lucio leaped out behind me, and after him our Spaniard servant, and the three of us stood there gazing at the big picture as it swung back into place, it began to make me wonder a great deal. "I thought so," were Lucio's first words after we had come out. "Hawkins, we should have had enough sense to know that that big picture was really a door." "It's all right," I said. "I'm glad we're out of that dark place, that's all. It makes no difference to me what is or what isn't a hidden door. Believe me, Uncle Lucio, I'm never going in there again." Lucio smiled. "What fooled me," he said, "was that it looked like a wall. I'll tell you, Hawkins, that tunnel is new, but the place behind the picture is old. It was built when the house was built. Come around outside and let's have a look." We went outside and around to the wall behind the place, where the picture hung. The wall here bulged out into a half circle, which left plenty room behind the picture for a passage. "You see," said Lucio, "if we had noticed this round place in the wall, we would have suspected a hidden place behind the big picture. But it makes no difference. We know it now. Come on and help me find something to eat. I suppose you are hungry, Hawkins?" But Valdez had already started to hand some food, and in a while he called us to a supper of bread and cold meats that he had found in the kitchen. Gabriel was not about the place, he told Lucio, nor was there another servant in the house. We sat there, Lucio and I, and ate in silence. We were tired. We had been for 2 days and a night in the underground. We must have walked miles through the caves under Casanova's rocks, and when there was at least 2 miles of tunnel that we had traveled before, we reached the place behind the big picture. How that big painting fascinated me now, as I gazed at it through the door of the dining room. How I remembered now the night when, on going downstairs for an apple, I had imagined that the figure of the Spanish lady had moved or motioned to me. At last I knew what had caused that. The picture had moved. The door had been partly opened, and light from the hall, glancing upon it, had caused it to appear as though the picture of the lady had made a motion for me. And the sound of the chains, that, too, had come from behind the big painting. And the man with the candle, who prowled about our library at midnight, he, too, had come from behind the picture and had made his escape that way. After we had finished our little meal, Lucio lit a cigar and sat in one of the big easy chairs, while I sat in the window seat, and Valdez cleared the table. Wonder why Doc Waters hasn't shown up, I said. They should be along now soon, remarked Lucio. If the doctor follows my instructions, he will be in Havana about this time, telling the story of her disappearance to my lawyer. And now that we know the secret of that big painting on the wall, I said, what is the next step, Uncle Lucio? Find the treasure, said Uncle Lucio, smiling. That is, if we can find the second chart. All at once a thought struck me. Wait, I said, and I sped up the steps and into the room that had been occupied by Link and me. I climbed upon a chair and drew out from the little cabinet on the shelf in the clothes closet the old books that Link had discovered there. With my arms full, I hurried back downstairs. Here, I said, these are books that were hidden, as though they contained something that shouldn't be in the library. They're all in Spanish, though. See if they tell anything. Lucio laid down his cigar and reached for the dusty books. I watched him as he went slowly through the brown pages, but he always shook his head. Written by the first Casanova, he said. I don't believe it. Still, they are very old, hundreds of years, I suppose. You don't see such papers nowadays, Hawkins. The ink was red or brown. Listen to this. 400 pounds buried under the 3 crosses. That means nothing to us, does it? Wherever the 3 crosses were, it's safe to believe they are gone now. But the whole book is full of such stuff. Let me translate this. Granada gold in vinegar casks in the brown man's neck. That sounds like foolishness, doesn't it? Yet it meant something to the fellow who wrote this book. Here's another funny sentence. The key to all things shall now be found in the old ruins of the watchtower. No, Hawkins, we won't get any assistance from this book. Wait, though, here's a map. Together we bent over the last page of the book. The lines drawn upon it were in a new ink, and in a different handwriting. It seemed as though the drawing had been faded out, and that someone had traced it with fresh ink, in order that it should not disappear altogether. After I had studied it for some minutes, I looked up and found Lucio gazing up at the ceiling, blowing smoke rings. Well, I said, doesn't this map mean anything to you? It does, he answered quietly. In fact, Hawkins, it means everything. What do you read in it? Nothing much, I said. It doesn't tell anything very plainly, does it? Only one thing it tells plainly, said Lucio, and that is that we have been hunting on the wrong side of the bay. You notice on the map that little pile of stones in a circle. Well, that's the old Spanish watchtower, or what's left of it. You can see by the waving lines, which represent water, that it is on the other side of the bay from Casanova's wrecks and near the shore of the sea. I studied the little map again and saw that Lucio was right. We talked about it for about an hour, I suppose, before I realized that it was getting late, and that Doc Waters had promised to leave Casanova's wrecks if we had not shown up by morning. Here it was night time, and he had not yet come. I began to be afraid, and somehow the Villa Casanova did not seem to me to be a safe place to sleep. I was just telling Lucio how I felt about it when there came a loud pounding on the front door. Valdez ran to open it, but before he could reach it, the door burst open, and in rushed Link's father, followed by Will Standish. "Oh, Lord, Luge!" cried Mr. Lambert as he caught sight of us. "Come with me right away! We've lost the boy!" The news took us by surprise. It was a minute before Lucio spoke. "You mean Link is gone?" he asked. Mr. Lambert nodded his head. "Yes," he said. "This morning, when we woke up, he was gone, him and the dog. We had things all set for starting home, to get your lawyer to find you. But when we found him gone, we had to stay and hunt for him. Doug Waters is nearly worried to death. This nice young feller came down to the bay in his green motorboat, and Doug asked him would he bring me up here to get your lawyer. We didn't expect to find you any more, Luge, you and Hawkins. We thought you died down there in that hole. I think that's where Link's gone too. He said he would go down to find you if you didn't come back." Lucio listened to Mr. Lambert's speech with a worried look upon his handsome face, and then he sat in his chair and covered his eyes with his hands. "I should have known it would happen," he said, "and I suppose it's my fault for leaving you fellows alone. Poor little skinny nephew. Wonder where they have taken him." He seemed to be saying this to himself, but at his words Link's father stepped up to him and laid his hand upon his shoulder. "You mean they've got him, Raphael and his pirate bunch?" he asked in a whisper. Lucio did not answer him, but stood up suddenly and said, "Come, there is no time to lose. We will save the boy if he is yet alive." Then, turning to Will Standish, he asked, "Billy, will you be kind enough to let me use your motor boat tonight?" "Certainly," answered Will promptly. "And Mr. Lucio, I'll go along with you if you ask my dad. He won't mind if he knows I'm with you." "That would be fine," said Lucio. "You know how to run that little boat better than I do. I'll get your dad on the phone at once. Everybody be ready in 5 minutes." 20 minutes later, we were on the river, and the noise of Will's motor boat sounded like music to my ears. As we sped for the rocks of Casanova as fast as the little craft could make it, Will seemed to be trying to outdo himself in making the motor hum, and though he was noted as a speed fiend on the river in daytime, no one ever saw him go as fast as he did that night, when Lucio had told him that the life of Link Lambert was in danger. I, for one, was glad that we were speeding away from Villa Casanova. Ever since Broken Nose Diego died, I had a fear of the place. And now that I saw that the big painting covered a hidden entrance to the big white house, I had no desire to sleep there any more. I would have given $100 if the boys back home could have seen us that night. Little did they ever dream that their secretary would one day be driving like mad down a dark river that was lighted only by the strong headlight on the prow of a little green motor boat. It must have been about 11 o'clock when our noise attracted attention and a light was thrown upon us from the shore on our left, and we heard Doug Waters' lusty yell. We slackened our speed and steered for the big, dark hulk of the Casanova boat. Therese and two of the men stood beside Dak Waters and threw us a rope, and in a few minutes we were fast and climbing over the rail. When Dak saw Lucio and me, he gave a yell of surprise and delight, and I know that he never expected to see us alive again. We sat in the big parlor cabin and talked it over. Dak explained how they left Link asleep in his bunk and had thought him safe, but in the morning, going to his stateroom, they found that the bed had been slept in, but Link was missing, and also Tellme, the big dog. They hunted all over the place. Dak even had gone down the rope into the ravine and searched the hole in the rocks below, calling to Link as he went. But not a trace of the skinny boy had he found. Lucio asked him 100 questions, which Dak answered as best as he could, although it was little information he gave. Then Lucio told about our escape from the underground, and of the discovery of the secret behind the big painting, and Dak was greatly excited. "I'll not rest till Link is found, Lucio," said Dak. "Hadn't we better start out at once and search till we find him? And believe me, Lucio, as soon as we do find him, I'm going to take these two kids back home to old Kentucky. I'm done with this place for good." "We will go slow," said Lucio, "and we will find him. You can believe me, Dr. Waters. I have a new chart to show you. Look at this." And while they were studying that chart that we found in an old book at the villa, I felt myself giving out. My strenuous trip through the underground passages and the exciting ride down the river had been too much of a strain, and I fell asleep there on the lounge in the parlor cabin. Will Standish was sound asleep on the lounge beside me, and I slept several hours. I know, for when I opened my eyes again, through the porthole window, I could see the first faint rays of the morning sun were peeping over the rocks of Casanova. But Dak Waters and Lucio still sat at the table, smoking cigars and talking. They had not gone to bed that night, and I was not surprised, for I knew that both of them were terribly worried over Link's disappearance. "Time to go now," said Lucio, catching sight of me waking up. "Here's Hawkins ready to start, Doctor. Wait, I'll see if Therese can give us some coffee." As he walked away, Dak came over to me and put his hand on my head. "We are going home, Hawkins," he said. "Very soon now. We will find Link first, and then it's the first ship back to the good old United States. I'm bound to bring you back safe to your ma, Sonny, and I'm not going to run any more risks. I'm through." "But what of Link?" I asked. "Suppose we don't find him, or—" "We've got to go," said Doug, and he brought his fist down upon the table with a thump, which woke up Will Standish, and he sat up and rubbed his eyes. We all laughed, and Doug continued. "It's a shame the way that poor boy's been received down here, and if it hadn't been for Lucio, I would have told the police about this business long ago." Lucio returned with an armful of caps and a pot of coffee. "Had to help myself," he said. "Poor old Therese is sleeping, and he needs the rest. I know. Here, you boys, take a cup of this. It won't hurt you." Will and I took the cups of steaming coffee, and Lucio poured one for Dak, and together we sipped the strong stuff, which made us wide awake. Suddenly we heard Link's father outside shouting to somebody. and we set our coffee cups down in a hurry and started for the door. But before we could reach it, we heard a joyful bark. Good old Tell-me. He had come back. For a moment, we all believed he and Link had returned together. But we were disappointed. Link's father rushed in, followed by the big dog. "Look here, Lush!" cried Mr. Lambert excitedly. "The big pup's come back by himself, all wet and muddy." "Oh," said Lucio, "as I thought, he has been in the water, swam across the bay, I believe, just where I expected to find him and his skinny master. Look at the rope tied to his collar. He has been tied up." "Yes," I cried, "and see what's hanging under his neck, Uncle Lucio." They all saw it at once, and nobody spoke then. It was a beautiful purse, a brown leather bag with a silver clasp that had been beautiful once upon a time. But it was water-soaked and dirty. With trembling fingers, Lucio grasped the thing and tore it from the few threads that held it to the dog's collar. He tore open the clasp, and it seemed we all expected him to take out of it just what he did, a message, written on one piece of cardboard that looked like it might have been broken off of a biscuit box. It was wet too, but the water had not soaked it much because it had been in the purse. Lucio's hand shook. He handed me the cardboard, and his voice was husky as he said, "Hawkins, read it slow." I believe Lucio feared something then. I believe now that he expected to find on that piece of cardboard a message telling us that Link was no longer alive. I believe that I expected the same thing, but there was a handwriting that surely was not Link's. It was too fine, too straight, too beautiful to be Link's scribble. Yet it was signed Link and addressed to Doug Waters. You could have heard a pin drop in that parlor cabin as I read these words aloud. "Dear Doug, I am safe, but come quick and get me out of here. Tell-me showed me how to get here, but he can't get me out. So I'm hoping he will take this message to you. If he does, I know he will bring you back to me. Follow the dog. Link." End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba by Seckatary Hawkins. In the dungeon. So it was Tell-me, the dog, who had lured Link Lambert away, and the note that the big dog had brought to us from Link told us that the skinny guy believed the dog would take us over the same route. We were not long in getting ready. When we hurried out to Will Standish's green motorboat that lay tied to our big boat, the dog ran ahead of us and barked as though he understood what was expected of him. And as Will leaped into the motorboat, the dog jumped into the water and started swimming for the other shore. No one said a word, but every eye was turned upon Tell-me. Will Standish started the motor, and we sped across the bay in the trail of waves made by the swimming dog. He reached the shore ahead of us, leaped out and shook himself, and then turned to watch our approach. The rocks on this side of the bay do not extend far inward, but they rise to a height that forms a wall and shuts out the view. We had to go through a narrow path that twisted this way and that around the wrecks. And when we had passed through, we saw that the country on this side had plenty of coarse grass and found palms growing, with here and there a palm tree holding its head above the other plants. I wondered then, as we tried to keep up the running dog, why we had not explored this side of the bay before. Only one of us had done so, and that was Link's father, when he had found the lady's slipper with a diamond in the buckle. But Will Standish seemed to know the place well. Lucio was talking to him as we walked, and Will pointed to a heap of crumbling stones that lay in a circle about a half-mile away, and said, "That is the old Spanish watchtower." Lucio expected the big dog to take us to these ruins, but he was mistaken. As soon as we had stepped out of our boat, Tellme dashed off in the direction of the grassy ground that led inward. He stopped to look back at us once or twice, and seeing us following, he continued on his way. He was taking us farther away from the tower ruins, but we could still see the crumbling heap when Tellme stopped, and we came up with him. Then he turned to the left and took a path which had been hidden by a wild growth like cactus. It was only 2 minutes' walk to a huddle of rocks about a half-mile from the shore. Tellme stopped again. "Well," said Lucio, "is this as far as we go, Tellme?" The dog barked and fell upon his stomach. His nose sniffed the pile of rocks. "On the other side, Uncle Lucio," I whispered, and I jumped over the stones. And there it was, a hole in the ground, etched with mortar that still held a few blocks of stone in place. The wild, coarse grass grew high about it, and prickly cactus cocked my shins as I walked. Lucio was over the rocks right after me, and together we stared down into this odd place. Crumbling steps were visible through the tangle of grasses. Tellme came leaping over the rocks behind Lucio, and dashed through the tangle and disappeared down the old steps. "Well," said Lucio, "might as well follow him. That's what Link's note said." "Lead the way," said Dr. Waters. "We will be right behind you." Lucio led the way, and we followed in single file. There were just 11 steps. I counted them as I went down, and then we reached a tunnel that seemed to be cut out of the solid rock. It was lighted on the right by little holes cut through, and I pulled myself up and peeped out, and saw that these uneven windows looked out upon the sea. We walked along in silence, only our footfalls bringing echoes in that underground place. As I walked, I recalled again that other underground place, in which we had become lost, and I said a prayer to my favorite saint, that I might not have to pass through such a frightful experience again. Listen. It was my own voice that spoke, but it didn't sound the same. Something had come to me suddenly. We had all heard it before. It was a sound that I had heard before, the sound of a beautiful voice singing, and it sounded far, far away. The sound was too faint to make out the words of the song, but it was the same melody that had come to us that dark night on our first visit to Casanova's doom. "Well," said Doc, "that sounds encouraging. Seems like we have company down here somewhere." "Hush!" whispered Lucio. "That voice." He said no more, but in the dim light from the zigzag window, I could see upon his face a strange look that I could not understand. The singing died away. We continued our walk. Tellme was no longer with us. He had gone far ahead of us, and the darkness further on had swallowed him up. Evidently, he knew the place well, and was on his way to Link, knowing that he had brought us here, and that his duty was finished. Presently, we heard voices. The sound came to us very clearly, and we tiptoed so that we would not be heard. I could smell the smoke of a wick burning in an oil lamp. "Let me lead the way, Uncle Lucio," I whispered, and scampered ahead of him. Softly, I tiptoed down the passage, which was now beginning to slope sharply, and before long I stepped and held my arms out wide, so that the others would step too. For we were standing in a sort of gallery that sloped in a winding way down into a big hollow chamber, in which several men were sitting and talking. I know how surprised the other must have been when they first laid eyes on the scene spread out below us. There was a swimming brass lamp hanging from 3 chains fastened into an iron ring in the dome of the cavern, and its wild flaming wick threw off a smoke that was enough to choke a person. Around the sides of the big room were benches upon which men were sleeping, wrapped in thin blankets, and at certain places along the wall there were places hollowed out in which there were men sleeping upon the floor. Beneath the swinging lamp was a rough table at which sat 3 men. At first, our eyes were not good enough in that dim light to recognize these 3, but gradually I traced the features of the big fat man who sat in the middle, and I knew I was looking upon Rafael Peralta. And when I recognized the other 2, my heart leaped. They were Gabriel Hausman and Montilla, the Cuban lawyer. Lucio and Jack were whispering excitedly to each other, while Will Standish stood in the shadows against the rear wall, so as not to be seen. I was about to tell Lucio that we had better go at once, when suddenly, in the chamber below us, a heavy oak door that I had not noticed until it moved swung open, and 2 rough-looking Cubans came into the chamber, holding my arm, 2 prisoners. I held my hand to my mouth to prevent the cry of surprise that I was about to utter when I saw them. They were Elam, the lame man, and his old sea captain. "Well," said Raphael, when the prisoners had been brought before his table, "what is the answer, Elam?" The greenish face of the little lame man scowled upon the big face of Uncle Raphael. "I gave you my answer before you threw me and my mate into that dirty dungeon," he snarled. "You ain't a man, Peralta. You made me a lame man, as I am, when you played ghost and scared me, so you could steal my diamond, and after I give you half. Now you've got me. I was unlucky to get cocked down here, and I guess I was born to it. We sailed over here in the Jonah, so we ain't got no kick coming. But you've got me, and I know when I'm bit." The dark face of Uncle Raphael wrinkled in a sarcastic smile. "Thanks, Elam," he said. "It's nice of you to look at it that way." Then the wrinkles and smile disappeared, and Raphael's voice thundered. "Unless you do as I say, you shall never leave that dungeon, never see daylight any more. You will die there, and die shortly, too." Elam's arm went up as though he would strike across the table, but he held it half raised, and the sound of those jangling chains reminded me suddenly of the rattle of chains that we had heard once. "You coward!" he yelled at Raphael. Then, seeing that it was useless, "I'm done," he said. "You've got me, Peralta. It'll be a hard shipping like that, but I'm done. I ain't a man that's likely to do anything for a man such as you be. Listen to me now, and don't ask me no more. The men in the boat across the bay will get you, Peralta. I get a feeling like I know they will. And I want them to, see? That's why I didn't trap them aboard my Jonah and take them out and sink the old bark like you wanted me to. Course, you said you would give us a motor boat to get away in before the ship went under. But I ain't never relied on anything you said since you played ghost of me. So I says again, no, I won't do it for such as you, Peralta." Peralta studied the greenish face of the lame man for a silent minute. "Listen," he said. "If I show you the treasure that I just have found, and promise you that you may help yourself before you leave, will you promise to get rid of my step-brother and those people from America?" Elam laughed aloud. "You ain't found no treasure, Peralta," he said, "and you can fool an old sailor like Elam a second time. No, sir, you fooled me into believing a ghost once, but you can't fool me now." Raphael shouted, and several of the men who lay asleep round about the room leaped up and listened to an order given in Spanish, after which they disappeared into a dark opening and came back carrying a load wrapped up in a blanket, which they put upon the table. Raphael stood up and threw back the corners of the blanket. I stared in surprise at the heap of sparkling gems that lay there, reflecting in many colors the dim rays of light that fell upon them from the swinging lamp. The lame man started forward, and his eyes were wide and wild. "By Jonah!" he exclaimed, and then, as if he was unable to say anything else, he repeated, "By Jonah!" Raphael smiled. "You see," he said, "I was not lying, Elam. Here is the treasure." But Elam turned away. "Come on," he said, "take me back to the dungeon." Then Raphael Peralta grew angry, and when he was angry, he certainly was a man to be feared. "Very well," he shouted, "take him back, and don't give him or his old Captain Jonah any more food till I order it." It had seemed to me that during the time the men were bringing out the blanket with the treasure in it, Uncle Raphael, while he waited, glanced up at us out of the corner of his eye. And now, as we watched Elam and his old companion being led back through the heavy oak door, I happened that he turned his gaze for one short minute full upon the place where we stood. But when I saw him gather up the blanket full of treasure, and with Montilla and Gabriel on either side, walk out of the chamber through the dark opening in which the treasure had been kept. I felt that I must have only imagined it. As soon as they were gone, the other men hurried about the chamber, folded their blankets upon their benches, pushed their chairs up to the table, and left, going through the same dark opening. The last man living jumped upon the table and blew out the smoking lamp. A few minutes after the sound of the last man's footsteps had died away, Doc Waters whispered, "Well, of all the strange sights I ever saw, that was the strangest. Who would have thought that Montilla would turn out to be—" That's as far I can remember what Doc said, because just at that instant there came a loud yell behind us. In fact, right upon us. Not one yell, but a dozen, and I caught a glimpse of these men we just had seen leave the chamber below, springing upon Valdez and Link's father. Doc and Lucio turned to go to their aid, but they were 5 to 1. I saw how useless it would be for me to do a thing. And when I saw Doc go down under a blow from a club held in the hand of a big Spanish ruffian, and Lucio struggling between 4 of them, I yelled to Will Standish, and we both went flying down the sloping passage, knowing not where it would take us. How I ran! It is a wonder that I did not smash into a wall in the darkness when I reached that part of the cave where no more windows looked out upon the sea. I don't remember what I was thinking about as I ran, except that I wanted to run and run and run. I never was so frightened in my life. I heard Will Standish pattering behind me for a while, but when I had to slow up because my breath was coming hard and fast, and I felt I would drop if I ran faster, there was no sound of Will behind me. I leaned up against the wall and breathed hard. It was pitch dark. I could not think. My head was going around and around. Suddenly fright took hold of me again. I thought of poor old Elam lying in a dark dungeon. I imagined that Raphael would catch me too, and put me into a dungeon the same as he had done the lame man. I began to shake. Then I heard a soft shuffling sound, and the next instant something pushed against me, and I screamed. My scream was followed by a loud bark. Hooray! It was Tell-me. Tell me! Tell me! It was somebody else calling. Somebody else had heard Tell-me's bark too, and was calling for him. I recognized that voice, the skinny guy. Link! I yelled at the top of my voice. Link! Where are you? End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba by Seckatary Hawkins. Trapped. Hawkins, Hawkins. It was Link's voice calling me. He had heard me. Tell-me began to bark wildly in the dark passage where we stood. The next instant he had bounded back on me and knocked me down. I grabbed his shaggy hide and held on for all I was worth. Go on, old fellow, I said to him. You've got to take me to your skinny master. I felt the dog's tongue licking the back of my hand. and he was whining as though he was glad he had found me again, as though he wanted to tell me something. "Go on, boy," I urged. "Take me to Link." Holding on to his shaggy neck, I trotted with him down the passage. My fear had left me. I felt certain now that I would find Link, and I believed that the ruffians back in the gallery had forgotten all about me by this time. Tellme stopped. I called to Link again and was surprised to hear him answer me close by. "Here, Hawkins," he called. "There is a spring on the wall out there that opens this door. See if you can find it quick." I had no light. My flashlight had been burned out the night we had spent in the caverns under Casanova's rocks, and I could not see a single ray of light shining through the wall anywhere. I put my hand up and felt along the stony sides of the passage. I could feel a very thin and even crack. I passed my fingers along until it turned to the right, and then down on the other side. "I've found the door, Link," I called, "but I can't see a thing out here." "It only opens from the outside," answered Link. "There's a spring somewhere. Try it again." If I had thought that the sound of our voices would have been heard, I suppose I might have gone about this business with more care. It was Tellme's growl that first warned me that someone was coming our way. I slid back away from the door and backed against the opposite wall, whispering to Tellme to be quiet as I dragged him with me. And I had just moved in time, for the flash of a lantern came down the passage and the sound of a heavy footfall. The next minute I saw in the dim glare of the lantern which he carried the fat bulk of Uncle Raphael. I tried to think quickly of a way to escape, but Tellme barked, and the lantern was raised and the light flashed upon us. "Ah!" exclaimed Uncle Raphael, "you have come to see your playfellow, yes? That is nice. Such nice little boys. Wait, don't try to go that way. You may never come back." I had started to back away from him and was about to dart into a side passage that the lantern light had revealed. "That is a very evil chamber in there," continued Uncle Raphael, smiling. "It has a stepping-off place into a shark's nest. No, no, don't go that way. Come, I'll let you in to see your American friend." I shivered as I thought of that stepping-off place into a pool where sharks fed, and I knew that Uncle Raphael was telling the truth. Tellme sat on his haunches, but he growled continuously. I saw Uncle Raphael lift his arm and touch the wall with his hand. There came a peculiar sound, as of a spring unwinding, and something was moving upward. It was a block of stone that fitted into an opening and served as a door. Valdez had told me that there were such things in the old days, when pirates used these caves for hiding places, and I knew that I was about to look into one of the torture chambers that were built centuries ago. The stone block continued to rise until it had made an opening about 4 feet high. Then the whirring noise stopped, and Uncle Raphael held the lantern above the opening. "Now," he said, "you go first." But Tellme sprang in ahead of me and began to bark. I followed. Uncle Raphael squeezed his fat form through the opening behind me, and I stood as in a dream, looking at a very strange sight. The place was lighted by an odd-shaped brass lamp, like the one I had seen in the big chamber under the gallery. It was a square-cut room, like a cell, and high up in the wall opposite were small square holes, like little windows, about a dozen of them, through which the smoke from the lamp was escaping to the outer air. The light in the cell was so dim at first that I could hardly see, but Link yelled "Hawkins" as soon as I entered, and then I saw him, poor kid, chained to the wall. The sound of his chains as he stretched his arms to me brought back to my mind the rattle of chains we had heard before. So, my dear nephew, Uncle Raphael was saying, I bring you a companion and good news besides. We have just had the honor of a visit from your father and his friends, and they are safely locked in where they will never see the light again. He grinned at Link and waited to see what effect his words would have on the poor boy. Link stared at him, but he did not speak. From the look on his face, I knew that he was terribly frightened. As for myself, I was so excited and my mind was whirling around so fast that I did not realize fully just what was in store for us. Now it is finished, continued Uncle Raphael. That is what comes of treasure seeking. You folks should have stayed in the villa and not poked your noses in my affairs. But it is as well that you did, for now I will be rid of all of you, and I can enjoy life again in the villa. Why do you keep him a prisoner? I asked suddenly. What has that boy done to you? You have no right. I have all the right. Here, broke in Uncle Raphael with that same evil on his lips. When people go into strange places, they should know what to expect. Soon your troubles will all be over. But rest easy. No sharks will be able to get you. For the last time, my dear nephew, I bid you farewell. He backed out of the little opening. I tried to follow him. He shoved me in just as the whirring sound began, and I saw him dodge out as the block of stone began to move downward, closing the hole in the wall. We were alone, both of us too stunned to talk. All of a sudden, I realized our danger. Link, I said, what is to be done? They've got my pop locked up somewhere, he said, as though he did not hear my question. I told him quickly how it all happened, how they had sprung upon us from behind and taken Lucio, Valdez, Doc Waters, and Mr. Lambert prisoners. Link listened quietly. Then he said, There is a girl here, Hawkins. She wrote that note for me. She comes to fill the lamp and brings me food. She will help us. My heart leaped with a new hope. When will she come? I asked. Link shook his head. I don't know, he said, but she will be here. I am hungry. I know she will be here soon with some food. We sat there on the stone floor, and Link told me how he had been caught by Raphael's men when Tellme had led him to these caves, how the girl had come in bringing food and fresh oil for the lamp, how she had taken pity upon him because he was a boy and made him tell her his story. Then Link had suggested that they trust the dog to get a message back to our boat, and the girl consented to help him and wrote the note, placed it in her purse, fastened around the dog's neck, and turned him loose. She would gladly have set Link free, but alas, those chains were strongly made and cunningly fastened. I, in turn, told Link of the dog's return to the boat, of our finding the note, just as we were about to set out in search. We talked a long while, and then I got up and examined the place. There was no possible way of escape. The only openings were the little square holes far above us. But even as I looked, I heard a slight noise behind the side wall to which Link was chained. I looked and saw an opening being made by fragments of crumbling stone being displaced. A face shone through the small opening, a white, pale, frightened face. "Little boy," came in a whisper, "are you asleep?" "No," replied Link, leaping up and going as close to the hole in the wall as his chains would permit. "Oh, it is you. I've been waiting for you to come and fill the lamp, little girl. Oh, it is you." And I'm hungry. You know you haven't brought me food since yesterday." The little pale face peering through the opening looked sad. "No," she said, "they won't let me go anywhere now. They've shut me up in here, right next to you. And they've put my chains on me again, too. See?" She held up her wrists, and we heard the sound of her chains. "Oh," she continued, catching sight of me, "there's another little boy." "It's only Hawkins," said Link. "He's my best friend. He's going to help me get out of here." The girl did not seem to hear. She was gazing back into her own cell. Suddenly she turned her face to us again. "Listen," she whispered. "Water is coming in this place." We all listened. By Jove, in our cell too, water was coming in somewhere. I could hear it trickling down the wall, and looking up, I saw the dull glare from the lamp reflected on the glistening wall, and I said, "It's coming in those small windows up there. It must be raining hard. Perhaps there is a storm." The girlish face left the opening. I heard the chains clank upon the stone floor, and then the sound of her weeping. "Good Lord, Link," I said, "I must get you out of those chains, and that girl too. This place will be full of water in a short while." That is not rain, as I thought. These are the old torture chambers Valdez was telling us about. They used to drown people in here. That's what they're going to do to us. Look, see how it continues to run down the walls. They've turned on the water, and we'll have to work fast now. Already the floor along the wall was covered with an inch of water. I grasped the iron cuffs by which the chains were fastened to Link's wrists, but I gave up hope at the first glance. We sat there in silence, listening to the water trickling down the walls and the soft weeping of our poor little next-door neighbor. I wondered if Lucio and Doc and the others were in the same fix as we were. I imagined so. Raphael wanted us all out of the way. He had this planned for us long ago. He would fix up some story to explain our disappearance to anyone that might ask. He was bound to get possession of Casanova Plantation, villa and all. He had succeeded in finding the treasure. Hunting for that was the only thing that had kept him away from us so long. Now that he had found the gems, he had begun to try to get us out of the way. Oh, the terror of that silent waiting while the water trickled through those little windows. Gradually, I felt the dampness creeping closer to us, and we had to stand up. I don't remember what Link and I said to each other. I've forgotten. Our minds were on one thing, and that was to save our lives and that of the little girl if we possibly could. I remember that when the water reached to my ankles, I grew wildly excited and went splashing around, trying to find some way to raise that block of stone that closed the opening through which I had entered. But it was useless. The spring was worked only on the outside. Anyone locked in was a prisoner without hope of escaping. The little pale face peered into our cell again. "The water is nearly up to my knees," she said in a frightened whisper. "Cheer up, little girl," I said. "It will soon stop raining, and then the water will have a chance to go out again." I still wanted her to think that it was raining, and that we would get out of this terrible fix all right. Link stood like a statue, silent and eyes staring. But I could not stand still. I moved about and slushed through the water. I tried to figure out how it was arranged that the water was turned into these cells through the little windows. I tried to keep my mind off of the thought of how it would feel when the water rose above my chin. But I had to think of it. I wondered if I would be able to swim around as the water got deep enough. If I could do that, and in that way raise myself to the little windows above and get a hold up there, I would be safe, for the water would not rise above the row of little windows. But there was Link, chained. He would be held down. He would not be able to get up. And then I prayed. I fell upon my knees there in that watery cell and prayed to God to save us from this terrible torture, and I never prayed so earnestly in my life. Link saw me kneeling, and he knelt down beside me and said, "Pray out loud, Hawkins." And I started, "Our Father who art in heaven." And as I did so, the little girl began to pray along, and when we came to, "And deliver us from all evil," Link said, "Amen." We got up, not minding our wet clothes. Nothing mattered now. None of us seemed to know what we were doing from then on. Tellme began to get uneasy about the water, and was dashing here and there and splashing right and left. Finally, to add to our worries, the lamp went out, and we were in almost pitch dark, except for the little light that entered the small windows above. In groping about, my hand came upon the little hole in the wall that the girl had made. I pulled and tugged, and finally got one stone loose, big enough to begin to pound with. I realized now that these cells had all been built in the cavern. These partitions were stone and mortar, crumbling with age. Yet even in their old age they held tight, and I found my pounding upon them with the stone I had forced loose made little headway. I tried the other wall that shut us off from the outer passage, but it would not work. So I just kept on pounding with that stone upon the wall, hoping that somebody had remained behind who would have enough pity to save us from that awful place. Then Tellme began to bark, and nothing would stop him. He seemed to understand the danger. I began to yell at the top of my voice in the hope that somebody would come and help us out, and I knew then that I was beginning to get nervous. I even imagined that someone was calling Hawkins somewhere outside. I kept on making the racket, and Tellme continued barking, but my arm grew tired, and I slowed up. What was that? The racket still continued. Tellme stopped barking, but the pounding. No, it was outside. No, it was in the little girl's cell. Hawkins! Hawkins! It was somebody calling. By Jove, I had not imagined it. No, it came again. Hawkins! Hawkins! Yes, it was Will Standish calling. Good old Will! And I heard other voices, while the heavy pounding as of sledge-hammers filled us with new courage. The little girl screamed as she pressed her face against the hole in the wall. "Somebody is breaking through," she cried. "They are hammering down the wall over here." "Good boy," I yelled. "Come on, Will." "Link, listen. It's Will Standish, and he's bringing somebody to help us out." End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba by Seckatary Hawkins. The Lady in Black. That was the most exciting moment I ever knew. There we were up to our knees in water, expecting to be drowned, like rats in a trap. And all of a sudden, we realized that help was coming. Link and I yelled for joy, while the little girl in the cell next to ours screamed at the top of her shrill voice, and the noise we made together almost drowned out the pounding of the sledgehammers in the hands of our rescuers. The pounding stopped, and we heard some commotion in the cell next to ours. I called to the little girl and asked who it was. but no reply came. I heard voices, but I could not make out what was said. Good Lord, I thought, could it have been some of those ruffians who had come only to save the little girl and were going to let us drown? My heart rose up in my throat, and then I replied, "Will Standish! Will! Oh, Will!" "Coming, Hawkins!" he called, and his voice sounded around on the outside of the passage. "Hold your horses, old boy! We'll get you out in a jiffy." As I turned to the side from which the sound of his voice came, I noticed that the water in the room was getting lower, and then I saw the reason. The heavy block of stone was moving up, opening the doorway, and the water was going out that way until, when the door was opened a foot, it rushed out in a torrent. "Just a moment, old fellow," called Will Standish. "There's no more danger now, and it's no use for us getting all soaked. We will be with you as soon as the flood goes out." The light in the chamber had now faded, and I knew it was night. But as the stone door moved upward, I became aware of a glow from a lantern, and presently Will Standish rushed in, followed by a well-dressed man, whom I recognized as his father, and after him came their negro servant, Abner Green, whom we had met one day on the Standish lawn. "Thank God," said Mr. Standish in a low voice. "I was afraid we would not be in time to save you boys. They've bound this young fellow to the wall. That bunch of keys, quick, Abner." The darky pulled out of his pocket a heavy bunch of keys, which Will's father took, and began to try them in the locks that fastened the iron cuffs around Link's wrists. "Oh, this one fits," he said, and the next minute the iron snapped open and Link's arms were free. "I can't ever thank you, Mr. Standish," he said, "but we must find my daddy. They've got him, and Doc Waters, and Uncle Lucio." "Don't worry," replied Mr. Standish. "Lucio and Valdez, by this time, are in Havana, telling the police what they know, while your father and Dr. Waters are safely resting in a room close by. They both received severe blows on the head, but I'm sure they are not seriously hurt." How we hugged Will Standish! He seemed to me then to be the greatest boy hero that ever lived, and we hurriedly told them what had happened. And now the water began to come in. Mr. Standish nodded his head. "I had heard of these places," he said, "but I never believed that they really existed. And I'm sure I would never have believed that a man such as Rafael Peralta would use them for such purposes." "They had Uncle Lucio and the others in a larger room with more windows," said Will Standish, "and the water was up to their necks by the time we got to them." "It was Will who saved them," said Mr. Standish, "and I am very proud of my boy for what he has done." "You know, after I got separated from you, Hawkins," said Will, "I happened to turn into a passage that led me right up to a hole near the seashore. I ran out and hurried to my motorboat and shot up home to tell my dad." "That's what he did," said Mr. Standish, with a proud smile. "And we wouldn't rest until I promised to come right back with him. So I told Abner to get some sledgehammers and picks and saws and things we might need to get you out. You see, at first I only imagined that you had been cocked behind a cave-in." "And then we came by the same way Lucio took us first," said Will. "And I started yelling as we walked. We couldn't get an answer till we had gone through a dozen different passages, I guess. And then we heard Uncle Lucio." "And saved them, just in the nick of time," said Mr. Standish. "Come, we had better take Link back to the room where his father is." "But I must see the little girl first," said Link. "She did so much for me." "Where is she?" exclaimed Mr. Standish. "We broke through the partition of her cell first and helped her out, for we thought you were all in there. Then she ran around and pressed the spring that opened the door. I thought she was standing here all the while." But the girl was gone, so was Tellme. The last look I gave to the place in which we had been imprisoned showed that the water had all flowed out, but was still trickling through the windows. Abner, the darky's servant, had a lantern, and so did Will, and they lighted up our way as we went back the sloping passage, and turned off to the left until we came to a low room, in which there were many cots and some pallets on the floor. Doc Waters lay on a cot near the door, while over to one side Link's father lay upon another. I will not write about Link's meeting with his father again. The poor kid cried when he ran over and called, "Pap, talk to me," and Mr. Lambert could not answer. What took up my thoughts just now was something else, some other good deed that might yet be done. "Listen," I said to Mr. Standish, "there are 2 more prisoners we might free, and they might be drowned by this time." And I told him about Elam, the lame man, and his old sea captain. At once Mr. Standish told Abner to lead the way through again, and we called as we went. "Elam!" I called as loud as I could, and when we had gone another 100 feet, I called, "Elam! Elam!" "Ahoy, mates!" came the muffled answer. I could not have told from which direction the sound came, but Abner caught it. "This way, Mr. Standish," he whispered, and from the looks of the Negro's face, I knew that this exciting business in caverns was enough to scare the kinks out of his wool. But he hurried ahead of us, and when we caught up with his light, he was hammering away with the sledge upon the wall of stones that was giving quickly to the hard blows. When we had broken through, the sight made me smile, even though I knew it was no time to laugh, for we were gazing through into a smaller cell full of water. It was lucky for Lamb, who was short on account of his lameness, that his old sea captain was a tall man, else Elam would surely have been drowned, for the water in this cell was already up to the armpits of the sea captain, who stood with his back against the wall, his arms raised to hold little old Elam, sitting like a monkey on the sea captain's shoulders. "By Jonah!" exclaimed Elam from his perch on the captain's shoulders. "By Jonah, Captain, look yonder. It's the little fat scamp as I met in the villa one midnight. Hello, youngster, throw us a line, will you?" "Sit tight, Elam," I said. "My friends are here with me, and we're going to get you out as soon as we can." But the old sea captain seemed to wake up suddenly, and seeing escape before his eyes so unexpectedly, took a firmer hold of the lame man, and began to wade across to us, as though the weight on his shoulders was only a feather. When he reached the hole we had made in the wall, Elam seemed to take a flying leap from the old man's shoulders and grasped at the edge of the opening. But the stone and mortar were loose from the pounding, and they came away in his grasp, and with a shriek he fell back into the water. The old captain tried to catch him, but missed, and the next moment he was floundering around in the water, searching for the lame man. It seemed that Elam was searching for his captain too, by the way he grabbed him around the neck when he came to the surface. And once more he made for the opening, but this time he went carefully about it, and soon was standing beside us in the passage above. His companion had no trouble getting through. He was a strong man and needed no help, although I knew he must be suffering some from standing in that water so long, with the lame man's weight on his shoulders. We took them down to the big room, and all of us took off our wet clothes and wrapped blankets around us, while Abner made a fire on one side and dried our clothes. While we sat there, Mr. Standish asked the two seamen questions, many of which Elam answered, but many of which I knew he was answering falsely. I thought to myself, Elam still has his mind on the treasure. He intends to sneak away and get it before any of us has a chance to find it. For I knew that Elam had come for one thing, and having suffered so much for the sake of it, he was not going away empty-handed. And so it was. When our clothes had been sufficiently dried, and we had all dressed again, Elam said, "I got one score to pay before I get out of here, mates. That greasy Raphael treated me bad. You know he did. And, if you don't mind, me and my captain will go find him right away." "Isn't it best that we all remain together?" suggested Mr. Standish. "We might have other trouble before we are able to get this injured man out, and in that case it would be best that we have as many to defend us as possible." "Listen," said Elam, tapping his finger on Mr. Standish's chest. "There ain't going to be no more chance for trouble. I'm going to get Raphael right now, and when he's gone, them revolutionaries won't have the courage to do anything more." "Revolutionaries?" asked Mr. Standish. "Did I understand you?" "Certain," answered Elam. "The whole push. They're all bad eggs, trying to get enough men to start a revolution." Suddenly Elam stepped and turned to me. "Why, Sonny, didn't you all know that Raphael was hatching this revolution?" "No," I said. "None of us ever dreamed he was doing such a thing." Elam whistled. "Well, I'll be blowed," he said. "He told me that's why he wanted me to get rid of you. And that step-brother of his, the old cuss, him to tell me that. Ain't I glad I didn't take you on board the Jonah and sink you in the ocean. You bet, Sonny. Elam ain't no kind to do such a thing. I can always tell fine folks from bad ones. I know that Raphael ain't no fine one. You all sit here till we come back." Nothing would have stopped Elam, and so Mr. Standish did not try to, and the old captain followed the lame man around like his shadow. That's how we saw them last, disappearing in the gloom of the passage that led back to the gallery where Raphael and his men had their council chamber. "Lucio should soon be here," said Mr. Standish, glancing at his watch. "I hope they do not stay away longer. These revolutionaries, as the lame man calls them, gather in these places at night, I suppose, and it would not be well for us to be found in their sleeping quarters." But time wore on, and still they did not come. I sat gazing into the smoldering fire that Abner had made, and Link was sound asleep beside me. I couldn't sleep. I knew my skinny guy had a hard time and was tired. I sat dreaming about the past and seeing myself back in old Kentucky soon. I heard a snore, and glancing up, I saw Mr. Standish sitting with his back leaning against the wall and sound asleep. Will winked lazily at me, and soon he, too, was sleeping. I began to feel drowsy myself. Only the memories of that horror in the water cell kept my mind awake. However, the cozy warmth of the fire made me feel as though I was safe. I felt my eyelids droop, and I felt myself dropping off to sleep. "Here," a soft voice whispered. "Here, come." I imagined it was my mother telling me, as she used to do, to put my head on her arm and close my eyes and sleep. And I cuddled myself up on the blanket beside the fire and slept. And then I imagined I was dreaming. I seemed to see silent forms pass before my eyes. I seemed to hear whispering voices. One of them said, "This is the one, for I know, because I talked to him and gave him something to eat. Indeed, it is the one." Suddenly, I knew I was not dreaming. My mind was cleared, and I knew that there were strangers in that room with us. I lay with my eyes half shut until I grew accustomed to the dim light. Yes, now I saw them in the dim light. One I recognized. It was the little girl who had been in the cell next to ours, and the other was— "Yes, Adelaide," whispered the other, leaning over Link. "You were right." She was a tall, beautiful lady, dressed in black and wearing a Spanish veil. She was crying softly to herself. She stretched out her arms as if to touch Link's head. The girl held her arm back and shook her head, and began to draw her toward the door. Just as they passed the cat upon which Link's father slept, the lady in black gave a start and held up her arms. "Jefferson!" she exclaimed under her breath. And with that they were gone, the girl drawing her out of the chamber and into the gloom of the passage. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba by Seckatary Hawkins. Restored to his mother. It was the voice of Uncle Lucio that wakened me, and I woke up with much surprise, for I had dropped off to sleep unwillingly, after I had made up my mind not to close my eyes until Lucio was with us again. Lucio stood in the doorway of the underground sleeping chamber smiling upon Link, who still lay fast asleep, and Will Standish, who sat rubbing his eyes and gaping. "Did you think I was never coming back?" Uncle Lucio was asking Will's father. I knew you would, but I had all I could do to make those police believe that there was a revolution hatching down here. However, they came. The police boat is right off the bay, and they are now surrounding this place. I hardly think they will escape. Is it not wise for us to go at once? Asked Mr. Standish. Indeed, I think it is, replied Lucio. Come, Valdez, let us get Doc Waters and Jeff to the boat first. They took Doc away first, carrying him on the cat down to the boat. Poor old Doc Waters. Never had a better friend in my life, and to see him knocked out like this was hard for me. But somehow our feelings were somewhat smoothed down there in those caves, with so much danger and excitement all around. And after they took Link's father out, I went over to Will Standish and whispered, "If anything happens before we all get out, you and I will stay right beside Link. When his uncle Raphael finds he has escaped, he might try to do something worse to him than tying him with chains." "Right-o," answered Will. "We will give 'em a jolly hard time, Hawkins, if they try to ram us again, huh?" "I don't know about that," I said, "but I know one thing. I've got good legs and fast feet, and Uncle Raphael will have to run some to get me back again. But Link loses his head when he gets excited. What we will do is to each take a hand and pull him along between us, and let me steer the way. It's always best for all to know which way to follow." "Suits me," said Will. But just then Link woke up. He saw that his father was gone. "Where is he, Hawkins?" he asked. "Uncle Lucio has taken him to the boat," I said. "It's all right, Link. We are going back to the villa." Link's eyes sparkled like coals of fire. "I had a dream, Hawkins," he said. "I dreamed that we all went back and were safe and sound in the villa again." "Yeah," I said. "That's right. Don't worry any more, Link. We'll be safe home soon." "But I dreamed something else," said Link. "I dreamed that when we got back to the villa, we found out that we forgot to save the little girl. And I dreamed that Uncle Raphael had thrown her off of Casanova's rocks into the shark's pool." "She's safe, all right," I said. "Will and his father saved her first, and then she came out and showed them where the spring was that opened the door in our cell." Link nodded his head. "I know that," he said. "But where is she now?" "You don't know if she's safe, Hawkins?" "All right, boys, come on." It was Uncle Lucio's voice. In a moment, he had come running back into the room where we sat. "Everything's ready, and we are waiting for you," he said. "And let's hurry too, before these revolutionaries come back. It's about time for them to begin their night councils now." Link got up and walked over to Lucio. "Uncle Lucio," he said, "I'm not going back unless we can take that little girl out of here." "What girl?" asked Uncle Lucio, surprised. I told him quickly of the little girl that had brought Link's food to him while he was chained, and of how she had been put in a cell beside ours to drown, as we were expected to drown. I described her as well as I could remember. "Good Lord," said Lucio. "Of course Link's right. It would be cruel to go without trying to free her. Listen, what's that? The sound of rough voices and many feet moving caused us to pause. In a moment, I had skipped over and stamped out what remained of the fire. Lucio produced a new flashlight that he had brought back. Careful, he whispered. Raphael's men are back. We must not run into them again. All of you follow me. We moved off in the opposite direction, not wishing to meet the ruffians who were gathering in the council chamber under the gallery, where we first had seen them. Lucio moved quickly, throwing his ray of light about until it rested on a dark hole yawning in the wall at our left. Mr. Standish, he said, this is a safe way to the beach, where our boat waits. You and Will go at once and tell Therese, the man who is running the boat, that if we do not show up in an hour to start for the villa. We watched Will and his father enter the tunnel. Mr. Standish had a light that he flashed ahead of them as they walked, and their shadows looked odd as they lengthened the distance between us. Finally, the light disappeared altogether. They've reached the bend, said Lucio. Now they are safe. They can't miss the boat. Come, let us be on our way. We followed the passage until we reached the opening of the cell in which we had been imprisoned to drown. I explained it all to Lucio, and he poked his flashlight in and peered at the place where his nephew had been chained. What a scoundrel that Raphael is, he muttered. A sudden sound caused us to turn quickly. Talmy had come back to us, was barking and jumping out there in the passage. Hooray! I shouted. Where have you been, old fellow, and why did you run away from us? Look there, said Link. It's the little girl. Lucio's flush turned just in time to see a little ragged dress disappearing behind an offset in the wreck. He ran up and threw his flashlight into the crevice. Oh, don't! Please don't! Came the terrified voice of her little girl friend. It's my uncle, said Link. He has come to save us, and he wants to take you back with us. Don't be frightened, said Uncle Lucio tenderly. We have come to take you out of these caves. Surely you must be hungry for a look of the sunlight again. Oh, indeed I am, cried the little girl. I've only been out since they put us in here, and that was at night. And I wore the lady's pretty slippers with the big buckles on, and was going to run to a boat I saw across the bay and asked the man to take me away from here. But it didn't do any good. Uncle Raphael came out and cocked me down on the shore, and then, when he brought me back, he saw I had lost one of the slippers, and he wiped me for it. Did he really? Asked Uncle Lucio. Well, well, what a wicked man. But come, we must get out at once. He has returned, and all of his men with him. They will soon come to see how their water traps have worked. And if they find us on the outside instead of in, they are likely to do something we might not like. Hurry, this way. Oh, but I can't go. I can't leave the lady, my good mistress, cried the girl. Lucio patted the head of golden curls. He said, so there is a mistress of these caves. We will set her free too. Come, take us to her. The little girl sprang nimbly up a series of steps. that led to a sort of landing behind the very cell in which Link and I had been in. Tellme barked and acted as though he was glad we were together again, and he ran up the stone steps so we could see. But it seemed that the little girl knew the place well enough to find her way in the dark. She reached the landing first, and we heard her talking to someone. She seemed very excited and glad to know that she would be able to get out. When we reached the landing, we saw a door or opening cut into a roomy place that might have been cut out of the solid rock. A light came streaming through the door. We three stood there, Lucio, Link, and I, watching the girl, who was telling somebody whom we could not see because of the shadows in that corner, that she had met us and we wanted them to come along and get out while there was a chance. Little by little, my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, and I could make out a low couch in the corner. And, while I looked, someone who had been lying on that couch arose suddenly and came out of the shadow. The next thing I knew was a startled cry from Uncle Lucio, and as I turned to look at him, he leaped over me and sprang into the room, holding out my arms and crying, "Lucille! Lucille, is it really you?" It was the sad-faced lady in black who had come out of the shadows. She turned a frightened look when she heard Lucio's voice, and the next moment she had stretched out her arms and was hugging Lucio around the neck. Link and I stood in the doorway, watching the scene. But suddenly something moved Link. He walked into the room with a quick step and touched Lucio's arm. "I know," he said. "It is the sad-faced lady whose picture hangs in the villa." Lucio smiled down upon the skinny guy, but there were tears in his eyes. The lady stooped and patted Link's head. "I wish you did know me," she said softly. Lucio was beside me, and as I looked up at him, I saw tears running down his cheeks. "You tell him, Hawkins," he said. "Tell him it's his mother. And don't you know, it's funny how things like that affect me. But I felt tears coming in my own eyes. I stood there like a dummy as Link listened to the lady tell him she was thankful that he had come to save her from this awful place. "Link," I said, "your Uncle Raphael lied to you. Your mother is not dead. You are talking to her now." There was a tender, eager look upon my skinny guy's face. He stared at the sad-faced lady. His lips parted. His eyes twinkled. His arms went up. "You?" he said hoarsely. "Is it true, Hawkins? What are you saying?" His voice broke into a sob. The sad-faced lady held out her arms. "My baby boy," she said, her voice trembling. "After all these years, God has sent you back to me. Come." Link clasped her about the neck. "Mother," he sobbed. "My boy," said the sad-faced lady. "My boy, my boy." Ah, boy, I can write good enough to tell you how I felt, but there was a big lump in my throat as I turned away. Tellme was barking wildly, happily. "Oh, Lucio," cried the sad-faced lady. "I waited so long. I knew you would come." "It is like a dream, Lucille," said Lucio, and his voice shook. "I can hardly believe it is you. And yet, all the time I believed Raphael was lying." You will never know what a terrible man he is, broke in Link's mother. I cannot begin to tell you now, Lucio. If you had only come sooner, you could have saved me from this. They came at night through the tunnel, behind the big picture. They brought me here, with only my little maid and my big dog. This one? Asked Lucio, pointing to Tellme. Yes, Nappy, we called him. They chained us, Adelie and me. Twice we got away and went back as far as the door behind the big picture. But we could not move the big chain latch. Once I had reached the secret door, it stood open, and I was about to step out when Raphael, who had gone there to search for something, came hurrying back in and slammed the big picture door shut. He was angry when he found me there. He carried me back here again. I remember the night, said Lucio. He looked at me and I nodded. I too remembered that night when I had gone down after Tellme and found the night prowler in the library. Thank God, all that is past now, my sister, continued Lucio. We have a boat waiting in the bay. We are going to take you along with us. The next second, there came the sound of fighting somewhere in these caverns, and Lucio sprang over to Link's mother and said, We have no time to lose. The police are closing in on Raphael and his men, and there will be danger. Listen. The sound of gunshots came echoing down the passage, mingled with the angry cries of the surprised revolutionaries. It rose to a great racket, and Lucio hustled all of us outside. Link and Lucio walked with Link's mother between them, while the little girl and Tellme and myself went on ahead. The sound of footsteps came louder and louder, and in a minute there came running 2 Cuban police, who shouted something to Lucio in Spanish. Lucio replied in a loud voice. Then they came up and talked rapidly, and turned and ran back. He says they closed in on the men and captured all but Raphael. He has escaped, they said. It would be like him to lay in wait for us somewhere and try to harm us if he could, now that his plans are discovered, and they are on his heels. Hawkins, head for the tunnel, where we sent Will Standish and his daddy. I headed quickly and found it. How fast we sped down that narrow hole. I could feel the friendly breeze from the sea coming in as we neared the entrance. And there, when we reached it, was Will and his father, who were glad to see us come out. Just going back in to see if you needed help, sang out Mr. Standish. I couldn't bear to take the boat home without you. Come, Will's green motorboat is waiting, and we will shoot across to the big boat at once and get away. We might shake hands with a stray bullet if we stay around here. We were soon speeding across the bay in Will's launch, which brought us quickly alongside the big boat, on the deck of which Therese stood waiting to throw us a line. Somebody's rowing out there, whispered Will as he stopped the noisy motor and made ready to jump out. Therese, he called, turn the big spotlight on the bay, quick! There was a commotion on the top deck as several of our men tried to reach the big light first. As the ray of light shot out, it seemed like a big magic lantern picture that we saw, a rowboat moving swiftly across the bay, and in it a fat, bulky shape, rowing as fast as he could. By jingo! It was old Uncle Raphael himself. He shot a glance up at us as our searchlight fell upon him, and he scowled and swore at us in Spanish. "Look yonder!" cried Will Standish. We all turned our heads, and I gave a cry of alarm. It seemed to me that the sky had opened, and we were looking through. But the next moment I cocked myself. It was the glow of a fire somewhere, and that fire was the old cabin burning. The cabin that Lucio had built up in the rocks for Link's daddy. It shot its flames high, and lit up the whole of Casanova's dome. And there upon that flat rock, at the top of Casanova's dome, two figures were running. They ran to a large three-cornered rock that stuck up on the edge of Casanova's dome, and seemed to squat down behind it as if trying to hide. I kept my eye on the place where they hid themselves, and one of them stuck his head up to peep over. And I saw it was the lame man, Elam. Then up came another head over the big boulder, and I knew that head with the handkerchief tied around it, for it was the old sea captain, friend of the lame man. We had forgotten all about Raphael in the rowboat. It was only when I saw the lame man and his sea captain shoving the big boulder that I began to figure out what they were trying to do. And then I yelled, and Lucio yelled. But it was too late. I saw that big stone roll over the edge. I saw it going down just as Raphael's boat was passing. It struck the little rowboat with an awful sound, a crash. We heard Raphael scream. I turned my face away, but I knew that Uncle Raphael was gone forever. The lame man had got his revenge. We turned our searchlight quickly on the deep water beneath Casanova's dome, and the man on our boat threw out a weighted rope, but it was useless. Only a few pieces of the wrecked rowboat floated on the surface, for it was a shark's nest. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba. This is LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba by Seckatary Hawkins. Duck helps an old friend. I was happy. Yeah, you know I was. And why? Because my skinny guy was. Poor kid. After all these years, and after he had thought that she was dead, he had found his mother. Boys, you don't know what it means. If you've never lived with a kid like Link Lambert, you don't know what it means. You boys all have your mothers, and I have mine. We don't know. We can't imagine what it would be to live without a mother's care, a mother's kindness, a mother's loving hands to help us all the time. But Link, that poor skinny boy, had been knocked about in his young life. Oh, I remember when he used to go in winter without stockings, without a coat. Don't tell me. I know what it meant to him now to feel his mother's loving arms about his neck, to hear her say, "My boy, my own baby boy." Yeah, I couldn't stand to be near him and his mother now. It always made me feel like crying when I saw them together, and I'm getting too big to cry. A boy that's traveled as far as I have, and has gone through as much trouble as I have. No, I haven't any business to cry any more now, if I can help it. And so that night, after all the excitement was over, and we were all safely aboard the boat again, going back to the villa, I sneaked away from them all. I went quietly to the afterdeck on the boat, that dear old place where Lucio and Jack and all of us had sat many times, and I sat down there by myself and thought of home and mother. I want to go home, I said to myself. I want to go home. Never had homesickness hit me as it did now, after all the danger had passed, and Link had found his dear mother, and everything seemed peaceful and happy. I thought of the old river bank back in Kentucky, of the boys, Lou Hunter, Jerry Moore, Dick Ferris, and yes, even of old Brigham, the Pelham leader, who was always doing us dirt. Yeah, I thought about them all again. Gosh, how I wished for those old days when I was just a kid, when I wrote down our doings in my secretary book and spelled every other word wrong. But what was the use? The headquarters we used to have was gone. We were up. We moved from place to place. We make new friends. Hawkins! Ah, but here was an old friend. I looked up at the sound of that gentle voice. It was poor old Jack Waters, his head bandaged, and leaning upon a cane. I thought I'd find you here, he said, smiling upon me. You see, I know you, Hawkins, my boy. You're the same old Hawkins, whether you be in Kentucky on a river bank or in Cuba on a river boat. I jumped up and helped him to a seat beside me. I'm so sorry, Doc, I said. I am so sorry they clubbed you. It must hurt terribly. I'm all right now, he said in a tired voice, as he sat down beside me. But it was taps and lights out for me, Hawkins, when that dirty Cuban brought his club down upon my round head. Lord, how he hit! He passed his hands before my eyes, and I put my arm about his neck. Poor old Jack, I said. You've been the best friend Link and I ever had. You took it on yourself to see us down here. And I'll see you safely back, he broke in. Never fear, Hawkins. A little thing like a Cuban shillelagh isn't going to stop me. What do you think of it all, boy? Link has his mother. We were silent for a long time. The stars shone brightly overhead, and some night birds were making music in the distance. That's why I came out here, I said. I knew that Link and his mother would want to talk over many things. That's how I felt, said Doc. And Link's father is just able to get about. He has gone in to join them. What a happy family reunion that will be, Hawkins. Yeah, I said. I wish I could see my folks right now, Doc. Somehow I couldn't stop the tears then. Then I thought about it. I simply felt as though I was a million miles away from the two persons who thought more of me than anybody else in the world. How I'd like to see Mother and Dad right now, gosh. Doc put his arms around me and chuckled, and I cried there, on the rear deck of that boat, so far away from home and those who loved me. But you can't blame a fellow for crying, can you? Gee whiz, as I used to say, Think of what I went through these last few weeks. Don't you think that it was bound to tell on me sooner or later? Sure, and it did too. Gosh, how I bawled. The following days at Villa Casanova were quiet ones, because Link's mother had taken very ill. Several doctors from Havana had been summoned, and they said she was dangerously ill, owing to the life that she had been forced to live in those underground rooms, and partly owing to the shock she had received when she had found her boy alive and well. I will not dwell long on this. You may be sure we were all anxious to hear the story of how Raphael had plotted to carry out his scheme, which had failed, and ended with his terrible end in the shark's nest under Casanova's doom. But we could only get very short and unreliable statements from little Adelie, the girl who attended Link's mother, and so we left her out of consideration altogether. But there came a time. How does it always happen that things will turn out so that a bad man gets his punishment and a good man gets what he deserves? I don't know. But it's God. Anyway, you look at it. God wins always in the end. The devil can go so far, but God always saves his own creatures in the end. And so it came about that, one morning shortly after our return to the villa, Doc Waters and Lucio and I were seated in the big library, talking over things, but mostly about the treasure. We believed that Raphael had discovered it, for we had seen him have a pile of precious stones in a blanket. Just as we were discussing this, we heard a sound of footsteps, but could not locate the point from which the sound came. But suddenly there came a harsh, grating noise, and the big picture of the sad-faced lady on the wall swung backward, and out of that dark tunnel jumped Montilla, the Cuban lawyer whom Raphael had sent to America, and who had brought us all to Cuba. "Señors," he cried, "Señors, save me, for the love of God!" What a changed Montilla he was! How ragged and shabby! How different from the handsome, finely dressed man that he was when he first appeared at our houseboat on that river in Kentucky. Oh, he was changed. His face was thin, and there was blood upon his forehead, blood of a few days old, hard and brown. He sprang out and clutched at the coat of Doc Waters. "Stand up," commanded Lucio, coming over to him. "Stand up, you faithless friend, and speak out what troubles you." Montilla stood up, but his knees shook, and he held up a trembling hand. "For 3 days," he whispered, "I have been hiding from them. The Cuban police. They have caught Gabriel. He is in prison now, but I have escaped. See, the cuts on my arms and head. I have suffered much, but I have escaped." Then he suddenly turned his head and noticed that the picture still hung inward, allowing an opening in the wall. "Shut that door!" he screamed shrilly. "Shut that door! They must not come in!" "We are here, señor," said a voice from a different part of the room. All of us turned our heads quickly. There, standing in the doorway of the library, was a Cuban policeman, smiling down upon the unhappy Montilla, and speaking excellent English with a faint accent. "We have followed you wherever you have gone, señor," he said, speaking to Montilla. "Did you think you should fool us? You were never far away from us. although at times out of our sight. We knew where we should find you at last. Montia sank into a heap upon the floor. It seemed as if all of his courage and his strength left him then. He gave up, I believe, like the coward he was. "Senor," said the police officer, addressing Lucio, "this man is wanted for plotting against the government. We are sorry if he is your friend. We must take him with us." Lucio waved his hand and walked aside, as though he had no objection to make. Two other police now appeared silently in back the officer, ready to take the prisoner. My eye happened to catch sight of Doc Waters. We sat there, holding both hands to his sorely wounded head, and looking upon Montia with a pitying eye. When the police strode over and took hold of Montia, I saw Doc start up and try to say something, but he sank back again into his chair, holding his head in his hands. "Wait," I said. "Perhaps Doc wants to say something." Montia caught my words and looked as though he still hoped for aid. Doc glanced up and made a motion with his hand toward Montia. I walked over and said, "What is it, Doc?" "Tell them," he whispered. "Tell them he was an old friend, schoolmates together. Montia was duped by Raphael. Fix it for him, Hawkins." "Gentlemen," I said, "this poor man was an old school chum of my friend, the doctor. If you will allow him to spend the night with us, we will surely see that he does not escape. We are Americans. You may take our word." The police officer made a motion to his two men, and they allowed Montilla to drop into an easy chair. The officer came over to me, smiling. "You are American, boy," he said. "We trust you with our prisoner. Tomorrow we shall call for him. He is in your care, senor." He made a low bow to me, and I, like a big boob, bowed just as low to him. I didn't see anything funny in it then. When you are in Cuba, you must do as the Cubans do. That's what I was thinking as I watched the policeman disappear around the portico. "Gracias, señores," cried out Montilla when we were alone. "Muchas gracias. You have spared me. Listen, I shall tell you the truth. Raphael drew me into this plot. I was never for a revolution, señores. See, he offered me a big fee if I would help him hide the lady in the caves and swear that she was dead. We drew the will and made her sign. Raphael thought that after he had brought the boy down here, there would be no suspicion. Then he thought he could bring about with all this money and revolution, which would make him general of the island. You see, señores, how it ended." We had listened to this as though it were a talking machine, not as though it were a man, flesh and blood, telling us this awful confession of Raphael Peralta's dark plotting. Doc Waters sat straight up in his chair. "But why, Montilla?" he asked. "Why did Raphael send for Link Lambert? Would it not have been much easier for Raphael to take possession of the plantation, saying nothing to anyone?" No, answered Montilla. "It was to get the boy out of the way. The sharks of the dungeons was to do that, señors. And then he would be gone. He would never be able to show himself later, maybe, and claim the plantation." "It was a wicked plot," said Lucio, with an angry look at Montilla. "Let me see. First, you were in a plot to kill the boy. Next, You were in a plot against the government. And lastly, you stole a treasure of precious stones that belonged to the owner of the Casanova plantation." "No, no," cried out Montoya, holding up his hand. "It was that which caused all the trouble, senor. If it had not been for the treasure, we would have succeeded. But, Raphael would seek for it, even until the last." "You mean he never found the Casanova treasure?" asked Lucio. "If that is so, how about the heap of gems tied up in a blanket?" Montoya smiled. "It was a treasure, yes," he said, "but gathered together from the rich ones who were also in the plot to seize the government, senor. We had not time to turn them into money before the police were upon us. It was the lame man who gave out our secret, I believe, and it was he, I know, who carried away the blanket full of riches after the police left. I was hiding while they searched the caves. They did not find me, and while I waited for a chance to get out after the raid, I saw the lame man and his captain carrying the blanket of treasure to the seashore. I followed. I saw them go into a little old ship. They made off in a hurry. It was surprising, senores, how fast that little ship got away from Casanova's wrecks." "Well," said Lucio, "the lame man worked hard, and I am glad he got something to take away with him, even if it was not the real Casanova treasure he was seeking. And then these three officers who had remained behind saw me and chased me. I fled back into the caves. I ran not knowing where, until I bumped up against the wall there," and he pointed to the picture. "Then I knew, senores, that I was behind the big picture." "Oh, you knew of that hidden door, did you?" exclaimed Lucio. Montoya nodded. "Yes," he said. "It was only a hollow hiding place at first, but Raphael had a tunnel dug from behind the picture to his cave. It was planned to come up that way at night, senor, to steal the boy and take him to the caves, where he was to be thrown in the dungeons. It was a vile scheme, but I had no hand in it, senores. I was to get a big fee, and it was not me but Raphael who was to do it. I was only working for a fee, senores." Poor old Doc Waters was listening to Montoya with a sad expression on his face. Montoya spoke a broken English, and I can't write it down just the way he spoke it, but even at that, it was plain enough for all to understand, and we all knew that Montoya was telling the truth. Under the circumstances, it was the only thing he could do. "Ah, Montoya," said Doc, "never did I think you would fall so low. When you and I were in college, I believed you to be a good boy, but you have turned out a bad man." Montoya turned his face away. "Alas, yes," he said, "it is so, Dr. Waters." Lucio shoved a handful of tobacco in his white pipe, and put a match to it, and began to puff hard. Then he walked over to the troubled man. "Montoya," he said, "what would you do if I promised to let you get away?" Montoya grasped his wrist. "Si, senor," he said, "I would take a ship for Spain. The escadrille is in the harbor now, ready to sail. I would get out of this country, senor, forever. I must not stay here. They are after me." His voice had fallen to a whisper. Lucio shook his wrist free, and took the lawyer by the shoulders. "Get up," he said. "You're not worth a single thought. I should turn you over and tell them to throw the key into the sea." Go up and wash the grime from your face. You will find one of my suits to fit you pretty well. Also, any other clothes you may need. And, he added, holding up a warning finger, don't try to escape from this house. We will have to answer for you in the morning. Valdez led him upstairs to Lucio's room. We sat down again together, none of us feeling as though we wanted to say the first word. But Doug said it. Poor Montilla, he said, the poor Cuban schoolboy that used to study in the same room with me. And here he is, a fugitive, glad of a chance to get out of the country. It was Raphael's fault, I said. But he should know better, said Lucio. He is not a child. He is a crafty, scheming lawyer who thought more of big fish than of reputation. I suppose we should turn him back to the police? I said. Yes, said Lucio. I suppose we should. That was Captain Silverio who came for him. I don't imagine any other would have allowed Montilla to remain overnight with us. But Silverio is my friend, and I should say to him tomorrow, Silverio, you are an officer, but I am not. You could have held Montilla a prisoner, but I could not, and so he's gone. Silverio would smile at me and said, Lucio, you are good for nothing, only a dreamer, and so I forgive you. Both Doug and I watched Lucio closely, waiting for him to say more, but the dear old dreamer continued to gaze steadily at the ceiling, while he puffed smoke from his white pipe. And Uncle Lucio, I said, you are going to let Montilla get away, for Dr. Waters' sake, aren't you, Uncle Lucio? Lucio did not remove his gaze, but puffed smoke in thicker clouds. You have it, Hawkins, he said. Montilla goes tomorrow wherever he wishes, for Dr. Waters' sake. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba by Seckatary Hawkins. In the brown man's neck. The following morning, Montilla said goodbye to Cuba forever. Lucio and Doug and I went with him in the red automobile to the wharf, where Lucio provided him with his passage and certain papers that we had obtained at the president's palace. I don't know what those papers were, but I imagine they were a pardon for Montilla on condition that he would leave the country. We stood on the Malcolm wall and waited until the ship steamed out of the harbor and started on her seaward way. And as we watched, the tall, slim figure of Montilla appeared at the rail of the ship, waving his Panama hat at us. But Lucio started the automobile quickly, and we turned our backs upon him, all but Doug Waters. I turned around once and saw Doug gazing back at the big ship with a sorry kind of smile on his face and a sad look in his eyes. That whole morning, Doug and I worked together to get ready for our trip home. Well, Hawkins, he said, we've been away from old Kentucky a long time. It'll seem good to be going back there, won't it, boy? Yeah, I said. Who's all going? Just you and I, he answered. But we will be company together. Link's got his mommy and his daddy now, and he won't miss us. But I guess we'll miss the skinny kid for a little while. Little while? I said. Why, Doc? I'll never stop missing that skinny guy of mine. Don't seem like going home without him. Kind of makes me feel like I lost a good friend. Doc patted me on the shoulder. Never mind, he said. You wanted him to be happy, didn't you? Well, now he is. What more could we want, Hawkins? He'll have it better now than he ever did. Lucio came walking in quickly. You two will want to go along this afternoon, he said. We have the key to the treasure at last. My sister, that is, Link's mother, gave me the information. Seems that Raphael knew she had the key of the treasure. He tried to force it out of her, but she held out. You'll want to go, won't you? We both shouted yes together. All right, said Lucio. I thought you would. Immediately after we had eaten our lunch, we went to the river. The boat was all ready to go, and as soon as we had stepped aboard, Harris gave the command to start, and we began another trip to Casanova's wrecks. How I remembered the first trip, and the second, and the one we made in Will Standish's motorboat at night. But this was broad daylight. No more revolutionaries, no more Raphaels to play Casanova's ghost. No more danger. Link and his mother and father had remained at the villa. Link had wanted to come, but Lucio told him it was best for him to stay at home and take a rest. Poor skinny kid. Lord knows he needed rest, but I wished he had come. Halfway down, we heard the sound of a motorboat. It was Will Standish. He hailed us, and we slacked up, and he came alongside. Therese threw him a rope, and he came over the rail like a monkey. Off on another adventure? He asked, grinning at us. You said it, answered Lucio. Here, Therese, hook this boat on somewhere. The man went to do as he was told, and Lucio continued. Willie, have you ever heard of such a place as the Brown Man's Neck? Brown Man's? No, unless it's that stumpy hill near the watchtower ruins. Lucio took a piece of brown paper from his pocket, unfolded it, and studied what was upon it for a moment. Then he said, You're pretty close to it, Billy. I imagined it was around the watchtower ruins. Have you ever been in those ruins? Billy grinned. Oh, just to peek in, he replied. Nobody would want to go in there very far. It's nothing but a tumble-down pile of old stones. We talked about other things until we reached the widening part of the river where the V-shaped bay begins. Suddenly, Doc Waters stood up, shading his eyes with his hand. By the big horn spoon, Captain, he said in a joking tone, clutching Lucio's arm. Come here and look. What does that shoreline look like to you? We all looked to where he pointed. The shore at this point rises sharply out of the water. As it grows higher, the grass and growing things get thinner, until at the top only the rock sticks out. This rock, as we looked at it now, seemed to shape itself into a man's head. This was it. There was the brown man right before us. The brown man that the pirate's chart spoke of. The longer I looked at it, the more plainly I could make out the forehead, the nose, the lips, the chin of a human face, formed by nature in the side of this mass of brown rock. A brown man indeed, but as for the brown man's neck, Alice, he did not seem to have a neck. That top rock that looked like a head was tacked down solid upon the rock below it. As I looked upon it, I wondered if this really was formed by nature, or if it was not chiseled out by some pirates many, many years ago, to mark a spot that they wished to find back. If that brown man's head could only speak, what tales couldn't it have told us? How many years had he looked out across the water? And how many ships full of pirates had he seen coming and going to these old wrecks? "That's the place, all right," said Lucio, with a ring of enthusiasm in his voice. "And, doctor, I believe there is a way to get into the brown man's neck." "It may be there is," said Doc, smiling. "But the gentleman doesn't appear to have any neck to speak of." "Well, whatever is under his head will have to be his neck," said Lucio. "What makes me wonder is why we never noticed this queer rock before. We've been down here many times." "Yes, we have," said Doc. "But it strikes me that unless you see this rock from a certain point, it doesn't look like a man's head at all. Look at it now, will you?" "By Jove!" I exclaimed. "Uncle Lucio, it's gone!" And it was. The hill of rock, which had seemed the shape of a man's head, was now only a shapeless mass of rock. The reason was our boat had drifted on down, and we were by this time halfway around a curve that brought us into the salt water. "But there are the watchtower ruins," said Lucio, "and I know that somewhere in those ruins is the place to enter the brown man's neck." We landed on the shore 50 yards below the brown man's head. Valdez, the pack horse as usual, went on ahead with lights and tools. We all ran up the slope and stood for a while looking upon the pile of brown rock that had seemed from the point up the bay to be shaped like a man's head. But it bore no such shape now. It was only when viewed from a certain angle that the surface of that rock looked like a face. "Come on," said Lucio. "Valdez is already down in the watchtower." We all turned quickly and ran for the place. Watchtower is not a good name for it. It's what's left of watchtower, for only a few feet of the old walls are standing. The rest has crumbled into dust. Its steps are almost completely gone. We had difficulty in picking our way down, but when we had entered, we found it easy to find our way, for Valdez had brought with him many small lanterns, which he hung all around the cellar-like place. "Is there a door, Valdez?" asked Lucio. The Spaniard hammered with his hand axe upon a square of stone set into the wall. "Believe me, that's not as old as these ruins," said Lucio. "Come here, doctor. See for yourself. The mortar that was used to set that stone is different. It's new. Can you get it out, Valdez?" Valdez only waited for the word. He set to work with chisel, hand axe, crowbar, in fact, every tool he had brought along. But whoever set that stone in place had done his work well. It was an hour before Valdez had it out upon the floor, and then only a dark, evil-smelling hole, dark as night within, yawned before us. It was about the size of the windows on our old houseboat, big enough for a man to crawl through. Valdez pulled one of the lanterns from the stone on which he had placed it and pushed through. We heard him walking slowly around, and then he called in Spanish. Lucio followed him in. They were together about 5 minutes, when Lucio's face appeared in the window. "Come on, you fellows," he said. "We've found a stair. I suppose we will have to climb." "Into the brown man's neck," said Jack, with a grin, and he helped Will and me through, and followed after us. I never smelt a place so foul as that dark hole under the brown man's neck. The air was damp, and the floor under our feet was slippery with slimy moisture. Jack had brought 2 of the lanterns in with him, and handed one to Lucio. Valdez was standing over in one corner, holding his light up to what I finally made out to be a winding stairway that disappeared in a twisting line into the dark above. We followed Valdez as he began to climb that stair. It was made of rough wood, the rail of cat saplings. As we went up, I noticed that the farther we went, the narrower became the room. Like a cone, it narrowed to the top, but the hole through which it took us was plenty big enough for 3 men to squeeze through at one time. We heard Valdez give a shout as we reached the top of the stair. When we followed, we found him standing in the middle of a circular space hollowed out in the top of the hill that had appeared to us as a man's head from the bay. A thin ray of sunlight pierced the dark, coming from a peep-hole in the face of the rock. In the light of the lanterns, I made out the shapes of a number of small barrels lined around the walls. Lying on their sides, dust of 100 years covered the casks, and Lucio went over and dusted one with his handkerchief and held the light to it. Granada was the word written on the butt end of the cask. He brushed another, and the same word was upon it, printed in a shaky hand, evidently with a brush with red paint. Valdez stood staring at the casks as though he could not believe his eyes. He turned at last to Lucio and rattled off something in Spanish. Lucio turned to us and said, "Valdez says this is the Granada gold he has often heard about. He says the old grandparents used to tell about it, but nobody believed it was more than a fairy tale for children's ears. All right, Valdez, let go with your axe. Let's see Granada gold." The axe flashed through the lantern light and struck the foremost cask. Out of that ancient barrel came a jingle, another blow, and still another, and there before us, as we stood in that little cubby hole in the brown man's neck, a stream of jingling coins rolled at our feet. None of us spoke. Lucio stood stock still, staring at the sight, while Jack Waters began to mop his forehead with his big handkerchief. Will Standish picked up Doug's lantern and held it to the pile of coins that had rolled out onto the floor. Their color, though dulled by time, glinted golden yellow in the dim lantern light. Valdez had dropped upon his knees, his trembling hands reaching for the coin, but hesitating, as though he was afraid to touch it. "At last," said Lucio, "we have the treasure of the Casanovas." "It looks like it," said Doug, "but ill-gotten treasure it is, Lucio. How many ships were plundered to gather a fortune together like this? How many lives did it cost, I wonder? Filthy gold it is, though." Lucio waved his hand. "Put that buck in the cask, Valdez," he said. "We will come for it all tomorrow. I must get out of this place quickly." There were no diamonds or precious stones in the brown man's neck. Whoever had found them in the hole under Casanova's doom across the bay had succeeded in getting away with them. Lucio spoke of this that night as we sat all together in the living room at Villa Casanova. "I believe," said Lucio, "that those gems were filched many years ago, perhaps by the same person who sealed up the hole in the watchtower ruins that led into the brown man's neck. He perhaps discovered the secret and found the entire Casanova treasure, not only the gems, but the casks of gold as well. We will suppose he did, anyway. He took the jewels with him, and, of course, we must suppose that he intended to come back for the casks later. So he sealed up the hole with the stone that Valdez chiseled out for us. But it was easy to see that the stone was left just as it had been sealed. The person who sealed it never returned. What prevented him from coming back after the heavier treasure, no one knows. But you can bet your last dollar that nothing short of death held him away. How he got a copy of the chart of the brown man's neck will never be known. Raphael had a copy only of the hiding place of the diamonds under Casanova's dome. That is why he dressed up in pirate's clothes and sneaked into our library at midnight to hunt through the books. He expected to find the chart there. Pablo Saules had a chart also of the cave under Casanova's dome, up the winding way to the end and thereunder. Broken-nosed Diego got it from Pablo, and to all of this it brought bad luck and a sad ending. I wonder if the Granada gold will bring us the same bad luck. Do you know, I feel uneasy about it. I feel now as we shouldn't have left it there, even overnight. I begin to think we made a mistake, Doug Waters. Sometimes I wonder if we did a mistake. I wonder if we should have taken it with us right then and there. And the more I wonder, the more I feel sure that we did the right thing after all. Who was to assure us that this ill-gotten gold would not bring to us the same sorry luck that the gems brought to those who sought for them? And what need had Link for more riches? He had his mother and father back with him. They were all happy together. What joy could riches bring to equal this? We did not go back to the brown man's neck until the following day. We talked about it that night and told Link and his parents how we had entered and discovered the Granada casks. Link's mother, who is one of the dearest, sweetest mothers in the world, declared that if the Granada gold had been found, it was to be divided among these who had stood by Link and had helped them all out of their troubles. None of us would listen to this, however. Lucio declared that if he took one single coin of it, he would earn it by working in the plantation or by something other than helping his own people out of difficulties. But it wasn't to be. God took a hand in it and made it plain that it was not to be. When we went back to the following day to the cubby hole at the top of the winding stairs in the brown man's neck, we found that a thief had come in the night. The Granada casks were gone. Gone. Empty now was the brown man's neck. We were shocked, disappointed, angry. We searched for some corner where the casks, having been disturbed, might have rolled into, but the casks were gone. The afternoon sunlight shed a piercing shaft through the peephole in the face of the wreck. I ran to this peephole. I don't know what made me look through, But I did so, I say, and the next instant, "Lucio!" I cried. "Look, the little ship, the Jonah, the lame man's ship, it's over in the bay." I can't write good enough to tell you just how it all happened after that. It was like a moving picture. I can't see it all yet as I close my eyes. All of us rushing, stumbling, falling down those rickety winding stairs out onto the shore. But it was a long way to where the Jonah lay anchored. We were surprised, dumbfounded. Montia had told us the lame man had sailed away. He must have returned. We could see him and his old sea captain in a little jolly boat alongside the Jonah, hoisting the last Granada cask into the ship. We shouted to them. They did not even turn around. They pretended they did not hear us. We now saw that there were other men aboard the Jonah, assisting with the loading of the casks, while others were trimming sail. They were making ready to leave in a hurry. Well, we all turned back upon Lucio's orders and made for our boat. It was quite a distance, perhaps a half-mile from where the Jonah lay. We jumped in Will's green motor boat and started after the Jonah, which had by this time set sail and was moving swiftly out to sea. And although its appearance gave it a bad look, the Jonah was a swift tub. By the time the green motor boat reached the bend of the channel, it was too late. What if we did chase her? What could we do to the ship, we few people in a little motor boat, against a band of ruffians like that? We stood in the motor boat as she came to a step and watched the sails of the Jonah disappearing over the skyline. But, as I said before, God had taken a hand in this Granada gold business. After all that happened, I know this to be so. No man was to have the ill-gotten gold of the Casanova pirates. For even the lame man, poor fellow, and his old sea captain never reached shore with it. This we learned from the captain of a French ship that reached Havana several days later. That they had sighted the Jonah far out at sea, that she was disabled and sinking, but they read her name upon her bows, and it was the Jonah. It appeared, the captain said, that an explosion had taken place in the vessel, and before the French ship could reach her, the Jonah sank to the bottom of the sea. We said nothing about the casks of Granada gold. Wherever the Jonah lies at the bottom of the sea, lies the Granada gold. Poor old Lamb, after all his scheming and hardships, what did it profit him? True, he finally succeeded in getting the Casanova treasure on which his heart was set, but it cost him his life in the end. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba by Seckatary Hawkins. Chapter 32. Goodbye, Cuba. Our adventures in Cuba had come to an end. It was time for us to be starting homeward, and oh, how I wanted to go home. The old longing for home had never been so strong as it was in these last days, but the joy of getting away from this place was lessened by the thought of parting with those we had grown to love during the days of trouble we had just passed through. "Link," I said, "I told you when we started on this trip that I would see you through to the finish. "And you kept your word, Hawkins," he said. "I knew you would." "But I can't stay any longer, Link," I said. "What makes me feel blue is that your home will be here in Cuba from now on. Your mother is rich, Link, and so you will be. I guess you'll be glad to stay here, though." Link's face had a worried look. "In a way," he said, "because I have my mother. You don't know, Hawkins, what it is like. I feel as if I don't care what comes now, just so I can stay with her and Dad. But I'd like to go back to the old river. Yes, I would." "And we will miss you too, Link," I said. "But surely you will pay us a visit once in a while." There were tears in Link's eyes as he shook my hand. He wanted to say something more, but his lips moved without making a sound, and he turned away from me and walked out into the garden. Will Standish came over to the villa that afternoon, and we had a talk together. I had grown to like Will very much since our arrival in Cuba, and he had become very much attached to Link and me. Believe me, I will never forget Will Standish. He did us many a good turn when we were in trouble, and he saved our lives the time we were left to drown in that awful torture chamber. "So you are going?" he asked as I came out on the veranda. "Back to old Kentucky," I said with a happy grin. "Back home, Will. Back to where the sun shines bright and the meadows all in bloom. You don't know how I long for the old place again, Will. My mother's there, and my dad, and all the boys I used to play with. Cuba may be a fine country for those who like it, and summertime all the year round sounds pretty, but give me old Kentucky with 4 seasons, the hot and the cold, and I'll be happy as long as I live." Will smiled. "You are great," he said. "You make me feel the same way. I want to go away. I'm tired of Cuba. But I've got to stay." "It's different with you, Will," I said. "Your mother and father are here with you. This is home to you. But think of me, 1,500 miles away from my folks. Why, every letter I got from home since I came down here made me feel blue. I'm too far away from home." Will nodded and for a moment was still. Then, "Link will stay here?" he asked. "Poor kid," I said. "He'll have to, I guess. His mother owns this plantation." "But they might sell it," said Will. "I'd like to see them try it," said a cheerful voice, and Uncle Lucia, smiling in his own way, stepped upon the veranda. "No, sir, Hawkins," he continued. "They'll not sell this plantation, nor anything that's on it. It's a big money-making place, and I'm going to see that it keeps on bringing in money for its new owners." "You?" I asked. "Sure," he said, laughing. "I am the new overseer. I will look after things while the others are away." "Who?" I asked. "Well," he said, "if you want to hear the whole plan, come over in the shade of the bamboo. We can talk there and be comfortable in those hammocks." Uncle Lucia was, after all, the leader of our little crowd. It was he who saw how the land lay after the excitement was over, and we had begun making plans to go home. This he told us as we swung in the hammocks. "You see," he continued, "I knew that my sister hated this place, after all the suffering she had endured here. We will never know how she suffered, because she will not speak about it. But when I suggested that she move away with Link and his daddy, she was very glad." "Lucia," I said, "you're a prince." "Thanks," he said. "I'm glad somebody thinks so. But I could not let poor little Link stay here, Hawkins. Why, he wouldn't last 3 months down here after you went back. He's crazy about you, and I want him to go back with you." I was too happy to speak, and for a few minutes we remained silent as Lucia puffed away on his big black cigar. "Where will you live, Uncle Lucia?" I asked. "Oh, somewhere, just so it's Kentucky," laughed Uncle Lucia. That skinny nephew of mine insisted that it be Kentucky. Doc Waters is downtown now, sending a cable to a real estate man somewhere in Kentucky, Lexington, I believe. I suppose Doc knows a good home somewhere, and it will not be a very small one because they'll have more money than they know what to do with after I get started running the sugar business. Lucia smiled and threw out his chest, and then Link called to me and Will, and I ran over to him. He had just heard the news. Doc had called him up by telephone from Havana and told him that he had made all arrangements for a return to Kentucky, and that while the deal for the new home was not settled, it was almost as good as settled, and that everything was turning out just as it should. God in his heaven and all well with the world. How will I ever forget that beautiful morning? Everything seemed to be just in keeping with my feelings, for I was leaving Cuba. Gosh, and wasn't I glad to get away. We were all up with the first ray of dawn and ate an early breakfast. Our trunks had already been hauled to the wharf where lay the seagoing steam yacht that belonged to the Casanova plantation, and which we had never seen until the morning when we were to board it for home. We left the villa in 3 automobiles, Will Standish and his father going along. Everybody seemed happy and gay except Link's mother, who had tears in her eyes and never turned her head to look at the villa again. I guess she was trying to forget. But Link was happy, and so was I, and I believe Will Standish was happy, although not for himself, but for us. I knew he wanted to go along. We were delighted with the steam yacht. It seemed a better ship than the one we had come over in. Therese led the way upon it, and we met the captain whom Doc Waters had brought from Havana to take us across. It seemed that Lucia would not trust the beautiful yacht to Therese, who was but an ordinary seaman with no right to command a ship. But Therese and all the other men who served under Lucia on our riverboat were given places on the yacht. It was indeed a beautiful boat, richly furnished, and our cabins were of the latest design, with every modern comfort. We watched the stowing of our trunks and chatted together while the men were making ready to sail. Lucia and Doc Waters were standing over on one side talking to Mr. Standish. Will came over to where Link and I stood and said, "I've a notion to sneak away and hide under something until the boat starts. Then I'd be sure to go with you fellows." "Why don't you, Will?" asked Link. "What do you think my dad would do?" asked Will with a laugh. "He won't move off this ship till he knows I'm on shore." "Look," I said, "they're talking about you, Will." The 3 men had turned and were watching us boys. Mr. Standish had a half smile upon his lips as he listened to something Doc Waters was saying to him. Then I heard Lucia's voice in a louder tone saying, "It would be fine. Plenty of room, the doctor says. Why not, Mr. Standish?" Mr. Standish said something in a low voice and then hurriedly went down the gangplank and got into his machine. Lucia and Doc came over to us. "You're to wait here until your dad comes back," said Lucia, addressing Will. "You boys can make yourself at home for a while. It'll be 30 minutes before the ship's ready to sail." We were glad to have that much longer with Will, and we made a complete tour of the decks and found many things of interest. Occasionally, I allowed my gaze to wander over the rail of the ship, into the faraway where the line of the sea seemed to meet the sky. The breakers came in lines of foamy white. The morning sun coming up from behind those low uneven hills that we knew as the rocks of Casanova threw a sparkling glory on the ever-moving surface of the water. How beautiful was this place, and yet how ugly were the memories that will forever cling to it in our minds. Ugh! I don't allow myself to think long about the past days any more. I knew what fear was now. I never will forget that midnight when I woke and found a greenish face peering through the iron bars of my window. the face of Elam, the lame man, God rest his soul, or the night Pablo Sols went over Casanova's doom. I can hear his shrieks yet. Suddenly, the throbbing of the engines told us the yacht was ready to start. Will started and grasped my arm. "Oh, Hawkins," he said, "suppose they should get started before my dad comes back. I'd better get off right now." Doc Waters and Lucia were smiling. We heard the captain sing out some orders to the sailors, and the boat felt as if it were moving. "Aboard!" called a voice from the boat. Will was excited. Lucia had begun to walk toward the gangplank. A cloud of dust from the roadway cleared way and showed an automobile coming at top speed. We had by this time run forward. By the time we reached the gangplank, the automobile was slowing up beside the wharf. Mr. Standish got out, and with him Abner Green, the old darky servant, and together they carried a steamer trunk. "It's all right," said Doc Waters. "You're going with us, Will. We had a hard time making your father let loose of you, but he says he will come for you in a few weeks." Will could not believe it, but we shouted and made merry over it. It was just like Doc and Lucia to fix up some sort of a little surprise at the last minute. We danced around old Abner Green as he came aboard with the trunk. "Listen, Mr. Standish," said the old darky after he had set the trunk down. "I's never set my foot on top of a ship since I had de bad luck to reach this yere Cuba. But I expect you all won't mind if this yere poor old nigger stay whar he is till this boat gets somewhere else, will ye?" Mr. Standish laughed good-naturedly. "You old sinner, Abner," he said. "You've been waiting to get away from me many a time. Well, I'm going to let you go. This is no time for arguing. The ship is ready to start. I had it in my mind all the time. You'll still be in my service, however. Don't forget that. You are to keep your eye on my Willie, you understand? And when you get to old Kentucky, stay right where Will is and work for Link's father as though you were working for me." "I sure will do so, Mr. Standish," said the darky, grinning. "I sure will. Cross my heart in that." At that moment the whistle blew. Will ran into his father's arms for a last embrace. We sprang upon Uncle Lucia, Link and I, and he hugged us tight to him and told us to think of him sometimes, and maybe he would come and see us some day. Link's father came out of the cabin with Link's mother, and they took their last farewell of Lucia. Then the whistle blew again. The last I saw of Lucia was there on the wharf. He grinned at us with his cigar held tightly in his pearly white teeth, and Mr. Standish beside him was waving a white handkerchief at us. That's how I last saw them, and they stood there until we had sailed away out into the deep water, and the morning mist, like a thin curtain, hid them from our view. We made the trip across on a rough sea. Before we had gone far out, we were all confined to our cabins, seasick. Even Tell-Me, the dog, seemed to be sick and lay in a corner all day. Doc Waters cared for us, but oh boy, when you are seasick, you don't want anybody to talk to you. I never felt so in my life. I forgot that I was on a ship. All I knew was that I was sick and wanted everybody else to know it too, and let me alone. Once I thought if I got out and went on deck and breathed some fresh air, I would feel all right. But as soon as I got out, a big wave set our ship over to one side, and I was slammed against the cabin with a bang. And I hurried back into my berth and fell upon it. Oh boy, I did not try that again. But Doc had some sort of stuff that he made me take, and late in the afternoon I felt better and managed to get out on deck. The sun was just disappearing over the western line when the harbor of Key West came into view, and a beautiful sight it was. I perched myself in a cabin window and there I sat and watched the lights on the quays sparkling, and they seemed to be saying, "Welcome home." It was the good old United States again. End of chapter 32. Recording by John Brandon. End of Seckatary Hawkins in Cuba by Seckatary Hawkins.